Chapter 1. Eva Stewart took in a deep breath of the warm March air as she strolled along on her morning walk. The shade of the mimosa trees that edged the street offered a delightful reprieve from the sun. Morning had dawned with a stiff breeze that now blew across the cemetery to her left. The week had been busy, and this Thursday morning walk was just what she needed. The Keys Bed and Breakfast, which she owned and operated in the heart of Key West, Florida, had been booked solid, all 7 rooms in operation despite the early time of year. She wasn't one to complain and loved seeing the breakfast room full as well as guests mingling on the main floor, but it had taken nearly every ounce of her time. Things had slowed down a bit, but would pick up again for the weekend. It was surprising, given the early stage of the season, but it could change at any moment. No one ever knew what circumstances might blow in extra guests, or what storm might roll in and cause guests to cancel their reservations. Her phone vibrated in her back pocket, and she pulled it out to see a text from Ruben. "Still okay for 10?" He was leaving for Cuba that afternoon and had begged to see her for coffee before he left. Her fingers paused over the screen, debating what to say. After the hectic nature of the first of the year, including a shocking case involving a guest impersonating someone and a murder in the alleyway next to her bed and breakfast, she'd relied heavily on Ruben. He'd helped install security cameras and a new alarm system for both the bed and breakfast and also her cottage at the back of her small property. Ruben had invited her to dinner several times since their celebratory meal at Carmelita's when the case was over, but she'd avoided accepting his invites. It wasn't that she didn't like Ruben, but her friend Vicky insisted there was more to his invitations than just friendship. She'd even gone so far as to put off the renovations she wanted to do on one of her guest rooms because she wasn't sure she was ready to work closely with him. The idea of having to second-guess everything she said was stressful. Eva bit her lip as she moved to the other side of the street to accommodate the lack of sidewalk next to the wrought iron fence that surrounded the Key West cemetery. Perhaps she should agree to meet him. It was just coffee, and he was going to be gone for 2 weeks. "I'll be there." Message sent, she shoved her phone back into the pocket of her jean capris and focused on enjoying the peace and relative quiet of her walk. While a cemetery may not be a common place for many to find peace, it was close to her bed and breakfast and offered a different type of scenery than the crowded housing that filled most Key West streets. Rounding the corner to Margaret Street, she headed into the historic cemetery founded in 1847. When she had time, like today, Eva slowed to read some of the headstones. The graves were above-ground tombs due to the high water table, and she found the sparse information listed to be intriguing. It was always her goal to look for the oldest date she could find, a silly game she'd once played with her uncle, and today was no different. She spotted a 1915 grave, and then one from 1890, but as she was rounding the corner, she caught sight of someone's feet sticking out into the pathway. While access to the cemetery wasn't limited, she usually came so early that there weren't many people around. That, as well as the fact it looked like the legs weren't moving, caused concern to ring an alarm bell in her mind. She turned around toward the gate she'd come in, but the pathway was clear. Then she did a quick circle, still not seeing anyone, before she moved off the path toward the feet. Every nerve in her body was on high alert, and she flashed back to the sight of a body covered by a sheet. The body they'd found in the alley next to her bed and breakfast. She tried to tell herself this was different, but it didn't feel different. "Excuse me," she said, coming closer. The feet still hadn't moved. "Sir, are you all right?" Now that she was within a tomb's length from the shoes, she could see they were expensive, real leather in a dark brown color with red soles. Louboutin, if she had to guess. And they definitely weren't moving. Avoiding every warning that sounded in her mind and instead choosing to focus on the fact that someone may need help, Eva rushed toward the feet. She slid to a stop, her tennis shoes skidding on the thin grass. A man lay on the ground, and there was blood. Stumbling back, she steadied herself on the corner of a tomb and fought back the panic that quickly surfaced. She needed to get help. She reached for the phone in her back pocket, but her hands were shaking so badly she all but flung it forward, trying to catch it but only speeding up the process of its descent. With a sickening crack, the phone connected with a stone tomb. When she went to pick it up, the shattered screen was black. "No! Please turn on!" She begged it, but nothing happened. She looked back at the man, but now, from the alternate angle, she could see that his eyes were open, staring lifelessly skyward. He was dead. She stumbled back, careful not to let the glass from her broken screen fall into her hands. Someone needed to call the police. But how? She did another quick circle, but knew that the cemetery office wouldn't be open this early. Trying to think of who lived near there, an idea popped into her mind. Willard and Bonnie Smith. Willard, a member of her murder mystery book club, had been put on a diet by his wife Bonnie, and now almost every time she walked this route in the morning, she passed by them. They didn't live close, but could she have enough luck to find them today? Rushing away from the grave, she paused when she reached the narrow road that led through the cemetery. She mentally took a snapshot of the area so she'd be able to find it, and then hurried toward the entrance she'd come in. Even if she couldn't find the Smiths, anyone with a phone would do. She reached the entrance and rushed into the road. While it wasn't exactly that early anymore, the retirees that made up many of the residents in the area were just starting their days. Perhaps she could knock on someone's door and ask to use their phone? She was about to make a random choice when someone called her name. "That you, Eva?" Willard said in his usually gruff tone. He stood just under 6 feet with a few extra pounds to lose around the middle, but if pressed, Eva would say he's looking a little leaner thanks to his wife Bonnie. The woman was the picture of health in her jogging shorts and tank top, a visor covering her graying hair. "Are you all right? Eva, you look like you've seen a ghost," Bonnie said. Then she turned and looked at the cemetery and grinned as if she'd just realized her own joke. No, I'm not all right." She rushed up to them. "I just saw a dead body in the cemetery." Willard's eyes narrowed like he was expecting a punchline, and only then did she realize how that had sounded. "I mean, a real dead body, like a fresh one." Now Willard's eyes went wide. "What do you mean? Where?" "In the cemetery," she said, throwing a hand in the direction of where she'd just come from. "Do either of you have a phone? Mine broke." She held up the shattered phone as if it were evidence. "Oh, goodness, be careful of the glass," Bonnie said as Willard pulled his phone out. "Want me to call?" "Sure," Eva said, sending a nervous glance over her shoulder. "I think I should go back there. Make sure someone else doesn't come by and happen upon it." Like I did. "Someone should go with you," Willard said, looking between Eva and Bonnie. "Why don't I call and you two go?" Bonnie said, looking a bit squeamish. "Okay, come on, Eva." His hand at the small of her back was meant to be reassuring, but it felt a little like he was pushing her somewhere she didn't want to go. She didn't want to go back to the body, didn't want to see those unseeing eyes again. But Willard was right. They shouldn't be alone there. "I'll direct them," Bonnie called out to them as her phone connected with her ear. "Hello? Yes, I need to report a murder." Murder. The word haunted Eva as she and Willard walked back toward where she'd found the shoes, the body. There was a chance it wasn't murder, though, wasn't there? She hadn't really looked at the man for obvious reasons, but she had seen blood on his head. Was it possible he fell and hit his head while visiting a relative's grave? The thought saddened her, and she took in a deep breath. "You okay?" Willard asked. Was she? Not really, but only for the fact that it was a very unsettling sight to come across a dead body while seeking peace and quiet. And in a cemetery, nonetheless. "I'll be okay." "So that means no." "You're a mind reader now?" she teased, the action feeling more like a normal thing than the reason they were here. "I may be old, but that's given me time to learn a thing or two about women." He slowed when he caught sight of the feet sticking out into the narrow walkway almost 20 feet from the road. "And what have you learned?" she asked, keeping her tone light and desperately trying to keep her mind off of what they were walking back to. "That a woman will say she's fine no matter what." He shrugged as if to say, "Told you it wasn't much." "There he is," she said, indicating the feet. "I can see," Willard said, resting a hand on his abdomen. He took a step forward. "I wouldn't—" "Hey." Willard took another step, then another. "Willard, what are you—" "I know him." "What?" Now Eva took a step toward the body, but halted before he came into view. It wasn't a sight she wanted to revisit. "Yeah, that's Charlie Wodehouse. Well, Charles, but everyone called him Charlie." Eva couldn't believe that she'd stumbled across a dead body, and it was someone Willard knew. "I'm so sorry, Willard." She flashed a compassionate look his way, but he was already raising a hand to stop her. "Don't get me wrong, I'm sorry he met his end, but he wasn't well liked at the club." "The club," Eva said, the sound of sirens finally making their way toward the cemetery. "The Glenna Club. It's kind of like an upscale gentleman's club, and before you go getting the wrong idea, it's all above board. We smoke a cigar or two, but mostly it's just a place to go for lunch and afternoon talk for us retired folk." He laughed. "We even let the ladies in," he said, dipping his head toward her. She was glad to hear that the club was forward-thinking, but what truly concerned her was what he'd said before that. "What do you mean he wasn't well-liked?" He looked around at the tombs surrounding them and whispered, "You shouldn't talk ill of the dead, right?" She gave him a look, and he shrugged. "I just know that those who partake in gambling, I'm not one of 'em." He held up his fingers in a scout salute. "Well, I've heard that he was ruthless in games. Took a guy's boat once. A houseboat." "That doesn't sound good." A police car came into view and officers jumped out, making their way toward where Eva and Willard stood. "Better move away from the body. Want to make sure we don't contaminate the scene." Willard looked at Eva and grinned. "I remember," he said, tapping his temple. "Guess I can thank the MMBC for inspiring me to do that." While the Murder Mystery Book Club was just that, a book club, they had also discovered that the club had a penchant for solving real-life mysteries. All the knowledge they gained from their reading exploits was put to good use in that moment, while Eva assessed the area where poor Mr. Wodehouse had died. While she didn't look at him again, she took in the way his body was positioned, as well as the tomb he'd fallen against. She'd wanted to get a better look at it to see who he might have been visiting when a familiar voice spoke up. "Fancy meeting you here, Miss Stewart." She turned to take in a handsome man with his hands on his hips, a twinkle of something in his eye. Was that amusement? "Detective Makos, did you come to see the dead body in the cemetery?" She allowed a bit of the humor that statement deserved to show, but not too much. She didn't fancy laughing or making others laugh where a man had met his end. "That I did." He slid his hands into his pockets as officers passed him to secure the scene with crime scene tape. "And imagine my surprise to see you, of all people, at my crime scene." "Alleged crime scene, don't you mean?" His shoulders hunched. "I suppose." "I wasn't expecting to find a real dead body here," she said, her tone turning somber. "Exactly how did that happen?" She explained how she'd come for a walk through the cemetery and how the feet had caught her attention. The detective's eyes narrowed as he glanced at Willard. "And you are—" Willard Smith," he said, holding out his hand and shaking the detective's. "Detective Jerome Makos," he replied. "You were at the, book club meeting." Jerome sent her a look before meeting Willard's gaze again. "I was. You only came once," Willard said, a question and a statement wrapped into one. "It's been a busy season, what with the added tourism." "I bet." Willard looked at Eva, then back to the body before meeting the detective's gaze again. "My wife's out front. What do I need to do so I can get back to her?" Eva smiled at Willard's natural directness. She had a feeling Jerome, originally from New York, would appreciate that. "Officer Kent," Jerome called out. "Will you get Mr. Smith's statement?" "Sure thing," Kent said, coming over with a friendly smile. "Another dead body," Jerome said when they were alone again. "Should I be worried?" She offered an unamused look. "I didn't plan this," she said, and then realized what it sounded like. "I mean, I know what you meant," Jerome said, pulling out a pad of paper and trying and failing to hide his smile. "Let's start from the beginning." "You're taking my statement?" she asked, surprised. She thought an officer would do it like Kent had for Willard. "Humor me," Jerome said, keeping his gaze on the notepad. "If I'm forced to talk with anyone before I've had my second cup of coffee, I'd prefer it to be a pretty woman." Eva felt the blush, but also saw the corner of Jerome's mouth lift. He was either goading her into saying something, or was it possible he was being honest? At 48, Eva wasn't one for playing games. She and Jerome, or Detective Makos as she'd called him during most of their first case, hadn't seemed to see eye to eye on anything. She'd roped the book club into helping her solve the case because she'd worried Jerome was too stubborn to ask for help, seeing as it was his first big case in Key West, but now she wondered what the real holdup had been. She'd noticed that Detective Makos had stopped coming around after the previous case closed. He'd come to one book club meeting and seemed to enjoy himself, discussing Murder on the Orient Express as if he'd read it several times, but then he'd disappeared. And now he showed up in his deep navy blue suit and coat, tie cinched tight, looking for all the world like he was back in the big city. But this time, He was flirting with her. Or was that her imagination? She wasn't really one for dating, but... "What time is it?" she gasped. He checked his watch. 9:30. Why, have somewhere to be? He asked the question with genuine concern. There was no way she was going to make her coffee appointment with Ruben, not if she still had to answer questions. She reached for her phone and remembered it was broken. Just then, she looked up to see her newly acquired best friend making her way down the cemetery road. Vicky wore a flower print dress that hugged curves and yet still managed to look extremely professional. What didn't seem to match were the black rubber boots. "Eva?" Jerome asked again. She weighed her options. It was better to focus on what was most important, and in that moment, it was telling Jerome everything she could remember from how she found the crime scene. A life, or perhaps more accurate, a death, was at stake. Coffee would have to wait, and she'd borrow Vicky's phone to tell Ruben that as soon as possible. "Sorry, you were saying?" Jerome studied her for a moment, and she felt a little like she was looking into the face of a human lie detector. Forcing herself not to squirm, she waited until he seemed to see what he was looking for and looked back down at his notepad. "All right, start from the beginning." Chapter 2. "You poor thing," Vicky said, hugging Eva to her. Vicky, or Dr. Clem when at a crime scene, was Ava's newest and dearest friend. They had met during the previous case, and Vicky had joined the book club right away as a big fan of mystery books. Since then, Vicky and Ava had enjoyed shopping endeavors, chick flick movie nights, and numerous coffee, lunch, and dinner dates. Ava felt like their friendship was a blessing to both of them. She'd lived in Key West for more than 6 years, and Vicky was new to the area. It was fun to explore together, and of course, it was always nice to have a shopping buddy or coffee date. But meeting at a crime scene was Ava's least favorite way to see her friend. I can hardly believe what I saw." She swallowed and pressed her lips together. "I know, it's not pretty. I need to get back to work, but I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Vicky had come to the crime scene in full work mode, as befitting the chief medical examiner, but after speaking with Jerome, whom Ava expected was the lead detective on this case, she'd come to check on Ava. "I'll be all right. Go on." Vicky gently squeezed her arm and then made her way back to where her techs were going through the scene. Ava watched her go, wondering what her ruling would be. Accident? Or was there more going on? She spotted Willard waving at her from the other side of the fence, Bonnie at his side. She couldn't make out his expression, but she assumed he was worried. She raised a hand and hoped that he took it for her sign that she was doing okay. Then she thought of Ruben. The sun was nearly overhead now, and she knew it was much past 10. Ruben would be gone, and she'd missed seeing him. She needed to borrow Vicky's phone and berated herself for not thinking of that while they'd been talking. Ava tentatively made her way toward Vicky, who was now talking with Jerome again. A tech gave her a look as if to ask where she was going, and she pointed at Vicky, miming picking up a phone. The tech just shrugged and went back to what he was doing. She was wondering if she should say something or wait when she heard Vicky's voice over the din around them. It was as if the wind had shifted, bringing the words directly to her. "I honestly can't give you my final assessment at this point because it needs further study." "As in it looks suspicious?" Jerome asked. It was clear he was looking for a specific answer from Vicky. "As in, I'm not sure, Detective." While Vicky always had a sweet southern twang to her words, she stood with her back straight and her chin slightly raised. Ava knew that look. She was being stubborn. "But," she pointed with a gloved finger, "at first glance, it looks accidental, and I could be inclined to believe that. Maybe the heat took over and this gentleman passed out, but I'd like to check the force of the trauma before I rule it accidental." "So we could be dealing with another murder." Ava frowned. Did Jerome almost sound excited about that possibility? Or perhaps excited was the wrong word. He certainly sounded as if he was anticipating something, though. "I'm saying I'm not ruling anything out." Ava saw him shrug. "We'll treat this like a crime scene." "I didn't say—" "Because," he continued, not letting her interrupt, "it's better to be safe than sorry, and it's protocol." Vicky rolled her eyes. Ava tried and mostly failed to cover a laugh. "Miss Stewart," Jerome said, turning toward her. "Eavesdropping." "No, she said quickly. "I need to ask Dr. Clem a favor." "What's that, darling?" Vicky said, stepping around Jerome. "Can I borrow your phone?" "Of course. Where's yours?" "Dropped it." She shook her head. "Actually, it was more like it slipped out of my shaking hands." Jerome's gaze softened on her, and Vicky made a pouty face that said, "Poor thing," loud and clear. "Do you need a ride back to the bed and breakfast?" Jerome asked. She guessed that he thought she was going to use it to call a cab, and she shook her head. "No, I walked here, and I'll be fine walking home. I just need to text a friend." Vicky's eyebrows rose, but Eva cut her off with a sharp look. "All right." He fished a card from his jacket pocket. "In case you need to get a hold of me and don't have your contacts." Thank you." She accepted his card with a questioning look, but then comforted herself thinking that he might have given it to her in case she thought of anything else regarding the body she'd found. His smile looked a little forced, but he quickly spun away to talk with another officer on site, and she was left facing Vicky. "I was supposed to have coffee with Ruben this morning," she admitted, typing his phone number into Vicky's phone. "I thought he was going to Cuba for a month. 2 weeks, and he leaves today, but we were supposed to meet before his flight." "Uh-oh," she made a face. "Hopefully he'll understand." "You seem awful worked up about this." Vicky's eyes narrowed. "It's not that." Eva shrugged and held her finger over the call button. "I just don't want him to think I completely abandoned him without a word. That's not something I would do." "Of course he'll understand. You did find a dead body," Vicky pointed out. Eva wrinkled her nose. "I'm going to leave that part out of it." "Why? It's a great reason." "I have a feeling he doesn't approve of my sleuthing." "What do you mean?" Eva thought back to their last case. He'd insisted on putting up the security cameras around the bed and breakfast and had been very helpful, but he always seemed overly protective of her. He often made comments about her murder mystery book club and how he didn't understand the fascination with murder. She'd tried time and again to explain it wasn't the murder she was fascinated with, but the solving of the crime, yet he didn't seem to understand. "I think he'd prefer I left the sleuthing to the real detectives." "Where's the fun in that?" Vicky said. "I know, right? At least you're already part of the case." She pressed the button and held up a hand to stay Vicky's rebuttal that would likely have been something about how she only got to do a few things when the detectives got all the fun. The phone began to ring, and she turned away from Vicky slightly for some privacy. His voicemail picked up. "Hi, Ruben, it's Eva on Vicky's phone. I'm so sorry about this morning. I was planning on being there, but something came up that delayed me, and then my phone dropped, and the screen is so broken I can't use it." She paced back and forth a little, taking in a deep breath of the warm air. "I know this was my last chance to see you before you left, and I'm sorry about that. Poor timing on my part, but this couldn't be helped." She cringed at how cryptic she was being. "Anyway, you're probably on the plane now. I'll get a new phone this afternoon in case you need to get a hold of me. Hope you have a good trip. Bye, Ruben." "Thanks," Eva said, handing the phone back to Vicky. "Of course. I've got to go back to the morgue. I'll call you, or should I call the B&B? "I'll get a new phone today, so you can call me." "Will do, bye." Vicky rushed off toward the ME's van. Eva drew in a deep breath before slowly letting it out. She wasn't sure why she'd felt so anxious to call Ruben. Was it the fact that his request for coffee had seemed weighted for some reason? There was nothing solid or tangible to lead her to that conclusion. He'd merely called her and asked to see her before he left. And yet something else lay beneath the surface. "Sure you won't take me up on a ride home?" Jerome said, coming over to her. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but his jaw was softened by a rare smile. "Positive. I came out here for exercise. Can't let a dead body stop me." The smile broadened. "I suppose you can't. Have a good day, Detective." "You too, Miss Stewart." Eva turned away, hiding her smile. She was about to make her way back toward the Margaret Street exit when she saw various news crews lined up. The last thing she wanted was to be interviewed, so she turned and headed toward the opposite exit. The plans for her day had changed drastically, and it was likely that her staff was trying to get a hold of her, but for the walk back, she would enjoy the silence. The morning hadn't gone anything like she'd expected, and yet the presence of a new mystery tugged at her like a child on its mother's coat. Needy, persistent, distracting. Either Mr. Woodhouse's death would be ruled a tragic accident, or was it possible Charles Woodhouse had enemies? It was obvious by his shoes, clothing, and connection to Willard's wealthy club that he had wealth, but did that translate to murder? She would have to wait and see. "Miss Stewart, can you tell us anything about the body you found?" Miss Stewart, are you working with the police? Miss Stewart, are you married? Eva blinked at that last question and peered through the sea of reporters that had somehow found their way to the front of the Keys bed and breakfast, cameras rolling and microphones poised. She held up her hand. No comment. Please leave room for my guests. Then, without another word, she pulled open the white picket fence that edged the street and walked toward the sprawling wraparound porch that was one of her favorite things about the Keys. Thankfully, the reporters knew better than to follow her onto her property, but they still created quite an eyesore for anyone passing by and any potential guests. While most of Eva's guests booked via their online portal or called in for a reservation, some had been known to walk in off the street. They were usually the more adventurous types, but she always found their company the most entertaining. The stories that vagabonds told were always intriguing. Huffing out a breath, Eva pushed the large front door open, the leaded glass panes letting in light but beveled enough to keep out prying eyes. "There you are," Benita said, rushing toward Eva. "I texted and called and couldn't get a hold of you. Then suddenly news vans started showing up and... What is going on?" In her mid-30s, Benita Alvarez was the Keys' housekeeper, but more like the brains behind the daily operation. She made sure the staff, consisting of Paz the gardener, Anton the chef, and Elena the maid, along with Jake the tech guy and sometimes front desk receptionist, were doing exactly what they needed when they needed to be done. It's a long, terrifying story, but suffice it to say I'm all right, and we may be dealing with the news for a while. Though she had no idea how they could have found her so quickly. Perhaps a call to Jerome was in order. That's it? Benita stood with her hands on her hips and gave Eva the stare that had gotten her the job she had now. "Sorry, Benita, I'm not sure how much I can say. Just know that there was a body found in the cemetery this morning, and we aren't to talk about it with the news." Benita's eyes narrowed, but then she nodded. "See. So your phone? It's broken. I can get Jake to get you a new one. That would be perfect." Eva felt tired, and her stomach grumbled in time for her to realize she hadn't eaten in several hours after being out in the hot sun. "I'm going to go make lunch and make a phone call. Let's get together before you go home and figure out the media situation." "You got it." Benita turned to go, but paused, her clipboard of daily operations clutched in her hands. "Are you all right, Miss Eva?" "Yes, just tired and hungry. Not to mention still haunted by the image of a dead body." "All right. I'm glad you're safe." Eva smiled back at her housekeeper. She was glad as well. She made her way to the kitchen, which was only used for the breakfast part of her business, and dug into the refrigerator. Pulling out meat, cheese, and toppings, she reached for the fresh loaf of sourdough that Chef Anton had brought that morning and made herself a quick sandwich. Pouring a big glass of unsweetened iced tea and adding a quick squeeze of lime juice to it, she sat at the small kitchen table. A few bites into her turkey and cheese, she paused to sip some of her tea, and then picked up the kitchen extension of the inn's phone. Eva pulled out the card Jerome had given her and dialed the cell phone number listed. She took another sip, the freshness of the lime tingling her tongue, and waited. 3 rings later, he answered. "Eva, are you all right?" She blinked. "How did you know it was me?" "Detective, remember?" She let silence be her reply. "I have caller ID. It says the Keys," he said with a chuckle. "Oh." She licked her parched lips. "I wanted to call because we've got a little problem with the media." "Oh, yeah?" He sounded like he was walking, his breaths a little heavier and the sound of conversation passing in the background. "I got back to the B&B and was accosted by several news crews." "Huh." He took in a breath. Yes, he was definitely walking. "Do you know how that could have happened? Are you insinuating that someone at my crime scene leaked the information?" He didn't sound offended, but she was also not sure how he was taking the news. "I just have no idea how they know that I found the body." "I don't know either." He paused, and it sounded like he was covering the phone. "I've got to go, sorry, but I'll look into it. You stay safe, okay?" She frowned. Did he think she was in some type of danger? But before she could ask, he hung up. Eva picked up her sandwich and took another large bite. Jerome was a puzzle to her, but he was usually a straight shooter. If she really was in danger, he wouldn't have beat around the bush about it. Perhaps he was just someone who was always worried about the safety of others. It was flimsy reasoning, but she was too hungry and too tired to care. She hadn't figured out Jerome Makos during their time with his first investigation in Key West, and she was fairly certain she wouldn't figure him out anytime soon. Best for her to focus on what she could figure out, and that was planning for their next book club meeting, where fictional murder was much more fun to discuss than the real thing. Chapter 3.
Call the cops.
Eva tried and failed to hold in her smile as Poirot, her Amazon parrot who was named for Agatha Christie's famed detective, Hercule Poirot, tried his best to earn a nut as a treat. "You think that's a good idea, my pretty bird?"
Pretty bird. Pretty bird gets a treat.
"I see," she said, pulling out an almond for the bird. "Shake for me." Sitting on his perch in the large white birdcage that took up a whole corner of the main floor of the bed and breakfast, Poirot raised his right claw and shook it. "Good bird. Here you go." He accepted the treat, walked over to the corner, and began enjoying his nut while Eva checked the time on her phone. The new screen was bright and a bit of an upgrade from her previous phone, but Jake had assured her that it was the best option. She trusted him, even if she wouldn't use half of the things the phone was capable of. Smiling to herself, she slid the slim phone into the back pocket of her capris and picked up the tray of treats for their meeting. The Murder Mystery Book Club, or MMBC, would be meeting in less than half an hour, and she'd decided to move the location to her back porch. Despite her best attempts to tell the news outlets that she wasn't interested in talking with them about anything, especially not the case, though she didn't say that, they still remained vigilant. She'd seen an article they posted about her discovering the body. It was a miracle that they hadn't discovered her involvement with the previous case with the Key West PD, something she hoped wouldn't come to light. But the last thing she wanted was to have her friends show up for a book club and be plastered all over the cover of some random online news magazine or media outlet. While some might welcome the attention, namely Geraldine, she had a feeling most didn't want to be brought in with this. For the 100th time that day, she wished there was a back entrance to the inn, but she didn't have that luxury. Placing the cookies on the wide coffee table on the back porch, she pulled the white curtains aside to her private part of the balcony. It was the only area where she didn't allow guests access, only for the sake of wanting a bit of a retreat for herself. Even now, kids splashed and played in the pool that took up the majority of the backyard as it led up to the cottage where she lived. She loved the happy sounds, and hoped the book club wouldn't mind too much. It was why they'd taken to meeting on the front porch in an area she reserved every Friday evening, but that wasn't an option tonight, not with the vultures, as she began to call the news outlets. "Hello, dear Eva," Geraldine said, waltzing toward the circle of seats in a bright floral dress that Eva would affectionately call a fashionable muumuu. Geraldine had recently dyed her hair a dark brown that looked at odds with her pale complexion and hid the natural gray she usually wore with pride. When asked, the older woman had simply said she'd felt like a change. Tonight she wore strappy sandals and carried a gold purse the size of a tote bag. Her gold hoop earrings caught the fading light and sparkled as she moved. "Lovely weather we're having," she said, sitting in an oversized wicker chair as if she were Cleopatra come to life. "It has been nice, if not hotter than I'd expected." "True. Do you need help? I got here a little early." Eva looked around. "No, thanks. I was just going to bring out the drink cart and that's it." "Splendid." She pulled out a worn paperback. "I'll just get in a little reading." Eva resisted the urge to ask the woman about her book, knowing from experience that the moment Geraldine had an opportunity to talk about what she was reading, she'd be there for a very long time. In most cases, Eva loved that, but not when she had preparations to finish. "Enjoy," she said, then headed back toward the kitchen. She added the cooled pitchers of lemonade, iced tea, and sangria onto a rolling bar cart, complete with glasses and sliced lemons and limes. Then she added small paper plates, napkins, and a carafe of coffee to the accessories and wheeled the cart to the back porch. "Oh, let me help," Elijah said, rushing forward to open the door to the porch for her. He'd just come in and had his usual messenger bag slung across his shoulders. He wore a peach-colored linen shirt over khaki shorts and light blue boat shoes. "Thanks, Elijah," she said, pushing the cart through as he held the door open. Characteristically, he had paint stains around his fingers where he'd tried to get it all off but couldn't quite manage it. Being a well-known modern artist, he'd moved to Key West from San Francisco to pursue different art styles and had found his way to their book club. "What's going on out front?" he asked as they entered the white curtain-shrouded area. Reporters, Eva said dryly. They aren't here for me, Geraldine said with a wink. Sadly, they're here for me, she said, sitting down in her favorite chair with a light sigh. I'd hoped they would leave, but no such luck. And this is about the body you found? Elijah asked. He pulled the strap of his leather bag over his head and settled into one side of an oversized love seat. Oh, that's what that text message chain was about? Geraldine looked up from her book. I thought it was the plot of a book. Geraldine was not only the oldest and longest attending member of the club, but she was the newest to their text chain about all things murder mystery related, something that had gone from fictional to real life as of the last case they'd subtly investigated. Nope, it's real, Elijah said with a laugh. Just then, Kay and Pete came in with a walking teddy bear following them. Eva took a double take. And who's this little fella? She asked. Meet Doodles, Kay said, rubbing the dog's fluffy head. He's a labradoodle and just the sweetest. Pete pulled out a treat and made the animal do a few tricks to prove just how sweet he was, and then they took their seats. The dog immediately tried to get on the couch with them, but Pete told him no in a calm but stern voice. The dog responded well, and finally laid down on the floor with a large huff. While Kay and Pete had 2 dogs, 2 cats, 1 bird, and several fish of their own, they opted to bring their boarding dogs to meetings. It was always interesting to see what breed or personality of animal they would bring. It was also interesting to see what article of Kay's clothing would have an animal theme. Tonight she had a leopard print sweater tucked over her arm and gold paw print earrings that sparkled in the light as they dangled past her pixie haircut. Quite the show out front, Eva, Pete said, reaching for one of the macarons she'd picked up from her favorite patisserie. They won't go. I keep telling them I'm not talking and would like them to leave, but... The sidewalk's public, Pete filled in. That's a bummer. Just then, Willard came around the corner looking a little red-faced. Are you all right? Elijah asked, moving over so the man had room to sit. Trying to get past all those reporters when they realized who I am was unpleasant, he grumbled as he reached forward for a macaron. Eva didn't have the heart to caution him not to take too many when she saw how flustered he was. Ever since Willard's wife had put him on a diet and exercise routine, he'd been grouchier than ever and always looking for a way to snack. She'd promised Bonnie she'd keep an eye on him, but there was only so much she could do. How did they know it was you? Geraldine asked. Willard frowned. Beats me. Someone's got a photo of me, and once one latched on, they all tried to. It was like trying to pull off an octopus or something. But you're here now, Eva said, pouring him a glass of unsweetened tea and adding a few drops of the sugar alternative. True. He accepted her drink offering with a nod and drank deeply through the glass straw. They chatted for another few minutes until Vicky peered through the curtains. Made it! She sashayed in wearing a deep red A-line dress and black stilettos. As usual, she looked pulled together and a bit over the top. Her smile was bright and friendly, making her look as if she had just walked off a runway somewhere. Well, looks like we're all here, Eva said after she gave Vicky a few minutes to settle in. Should we get started? You mean talking about the case? Vicky asked. All eyes turned to her, including Eva. The case, Pete said, looking to Elijah as if he'd missed something crucial. Elijah just shrugged. What do you mean, Vicky? Eva asked. Well... She looked between Willard and Eva. I thought with you finding a body and Willard knowing the deceased, it would be something we'd, look into. Willard nodded, and Geraldine leaned forward like she was watching a juicy sitcom. Kay's expression was hard to read, but Pete looked unhappy. Elijah, on the other hand, looked excited. I thought we were going to be talking about Death Walks at Midnight. Y'all know how much I love A.C. George, Pete said. But this is real, Elijah said. He's got a point. Real life is stranger than fiction, Vicky pointed out. Eva felt sorry for Pete, who clearly wanted to talk about the book. She identified with his desire. They were into the first quarter of the book, and she was looking forward to sharing some opinions about what might happen next. Well, I did do some digging. All eyes turned to Willard, including Eva. Do tell, Vicky said, sipping her sangria and taking a petite bite of a pistachio macaron. We will discuss the book, Eva assured Pete. It seemed to mollify him, though he still looked anxious. Kay, however, was staring at Willard, waiting for his answer. But if you want to share what you found, we'd like that, Eva told Willard. He nodded and looked as if he were slipping into storyteller mode. I decided to do some asking around the club. Club? Geraldine asked. Which one? While Geraldine was well into her 70s, she'd lived in Key West for most of her life and had been married to a well-to-do oil magnate named Hernando. When he died, she'd been left with a modest fortune, and it didn't surprise Eva that she knew of several of the clubs for the wealthy on Key West. The Glenna's Gentlemen's Club. Kay made a face. It's not that type of club, Willard quickly noted. They're in the process of changing it to just the Glenna Club so there's no more confusion, but women are allowed. He smiled, as if that would make it all better, but Kay merely shrugged. What did you find out? Eva asked. Right, well, Charles Wodehouse was not exactly a friend of mine. He put air quotes around the word friend. But I'd played cards with him several times. He seemed all right, though a little stuck up. I know the type, Geraldine said with a dramatic eye roll. Turns out that Charlie was in the middle of an ugly divorce. He was accused of cheating or having a mistress. Isn't that the same thing? Elijah asked. Willard shrugged and continued. But his wife wouldn't sign the papers. Why not? Pete asked, clearly getting into the story. It's a bit twisted, Willard said. His wife found out about the mistress. Or the cheating, Elijah added with an irritating grin. Whatever, Willard huffed. Anyway, she went to divorce Charles, but then midway through the process, she decided she still loved him, so she said she didn't want the divorce. But by then, he'd gotten a taste of what it was like to be a free man, so then he wanted the divorce, and they were at odds again. What a twisted web, Kay said, shaking her head. I wonder if she missed him or his money, Eva mused. Willard met her gaze. Exactly. I couldn't figure out what the agreement was or whether there was a prenup, but it seems as if it was a battle at every turn. That's not much to go on, Elijah commented. I mean, good job, but that doesn't mean she killed him. Wait, was he murdered? All eyes turned to Vicky, who was very studiously studying her manicured nails. You were the one that started this, Eva reminded her friend. Vicky sighed. I know, but I could get into a whole lot of trouble if I share. There were groans around the circle. But not if you guess. She looked decidedly devious in that moment. We really shouldn't, Eva said, but before she could stop them, there were guesses flying in all directions. Murder, accident, murder, accident. One at a time, y'all, Vicky said, holding up her hands. Was it an accident? Elijah asked. Vicky bit her lip and shrugged, which gave Eva all the information she needed. No, Elijah, it's looking like it was a murder. All eyes turned to Eva, and she alone saw Vicky give an almost imperceptible nod. If only they could know the details of what Vicky had found, but she didn't want to get her friend in trouble. Besides, it looked like Vicky herself might not be completely certain. What does that mean, though? Kay asked. Even if he was murdered, we don't have anything to go on. We know there's going to be a gala in his honor to support the charity his wife is heavily involved in, Willard said. It happens this Sunday, and everyone will be there. Everyone who knew Charles, at least. Eva considered this, and the group seemed to be waiting on what she might say. Since when had she become the one spearheading this suddenly true crime book club? Then again, she had training none of them knew about. Things she'd been taught at such a young age, they were nearly impossible to remove from her system. Not that she wanted to. Still, she didn't want to drag this group of excited book lovers into the midst of an investigation. But was going to a party really doing that? Eva nodded slowly. It does sound like we could learn a lot if we went, as long as we're smart about it. We should split up, Pete added, surprising everyone. What do you mean, honey? Kay asked. If we all show up looking like we know one another and no one else, well, don't you think it would look suspicious? He's got a point, Elijah said. Good idea, Pete, Eva added encouragingly. We can go separately and talk to anyone who might have known Charles. See what we can learn about him. Perhaps we can find the mysterious mistress as well. I bet she'd have quite a bit to say about what transpired. Then it's settled, Geraldine said, smiling like the Cheshire Cat. We're going to a party. Chapter 4. Eva woke with the sun shining brightly through her window. It wasn't as early as she would have liked, but Vicky had stayed late after the book club to share some of her findings. They both knew it was risky for Eva to be clued into what had happened, but at the same time she had discovered the body, and somehow Vicky felt justified telling her for that reason. Vicky had run several experiments and tests about the force it would have taken to create the injury on Mr. Woodhouse's forehead, and discovered the wound was too deep to have happened as an accident. There was extra force involved, making it a murder. Eva recalled the scene she'd walked into. There had been no trace of evidence to suggest someone else had been there. She had told Vicky, as well as Jerome, that she hadn't seen anyone pass her on the way out of the cemetery. But then again, it was hard to pinpoint exactly when it had happened beyond finding a window of time. After all the mystery talk, they'd gotten sidetracked talking about Ruben and how Eva still hadn't heard from him. They'd speculated reasons why she hadn't, and then Vicky let loose the news that she had a date the following day. As she'd put it, one of the lab technicians had asked her out as they were waiting for the test results to show, and she'd accepted. She'd giggled, explaining how awkward the man had been, but he seemed nice enough. Eva was happy for her, and they'd planned every detail of Vicky's wardrobe down to the color she'd paint her nails. Their chatter continued until the wee hours of the morning, like they were schoolgirls, not middle-aged women. Now the lack of sleep was catching up with her. She set the coffee maker going, took a quick shower, dressed in olive green linen shorts with a loose white tank top, and made a quick bowl of oatmeal. After breakfast, she slipped into leather sandals, letting her red hair hang slightly damp, and made her way toward the main building of her bed and breakfast. She passed a few guests enjoying the slightly less humid morning hours by the pool, and entered the air-conditioned space. Jake sat at her desk, staring at the computer. He was a college student and often held the weekend desk hours so he could make a little money when he wasn't working on his cryptology and technology degree. She let him do as much homework as he wanted, as long as his duties were done. On the opposite side of the room from the desk, she heard the sounds of diners in the sunroom that had been converted to the breakfast room. The smells wafting through the main floor were delicious, and she regretted her oatmeal. After checking on Poirot, she made her way to the front of the B&B. Though there were fewer reporters, she could still make out some camped out front. "It's enough to drive you insane," she muttered. "What was that?" Jake asked, looking up from the computer. "Sorry." She came to stand in front of the check-in desk. "Those pesky reporters, they're driving me crazy. I wish they'd just go home." "It's their job, I guess," he said with a shrug. When she looked back out the front window, she saw a young couple making their way through the crowd and then through the front gate. "Do we have someone else checking in?" she asked. Let's see." Jake tapped away at the keys for a moment. "Nope, we only have the green room upstairs available this weekend." "That's right," she said, watching them as they approached. "The Hendersons canceled at the last minute." "Yeah, something about getting the flu." She shuddered. "I'm glad they aren't coming and bringing that with them." "That's the truth," Jake said, looking back at the computer. "Who are they, then?" she asked, though more to herself than Jake. She only got a shrug in return from him. When the couple entered, the man stepped inside and almost let the door hit the woman in the face. Odd for a married couple. They looked young as well, probably in their early 20s, though the man looked somewhat familiar. Where had she seen him? "Hi," he said, coming forward. "I'm Ted Jackson." He smiled at her with overly bright teeth. "And who is this?" she said, looking at the young woman behind him. "Oh, right, this is my wife," he stuttered again. "I'm Danny," she said, holding out her hand and shaking Eva's. Then she sent her husband a look. Perhaps they were newlyweds? He forced a smile and then awkwardly wrapped his arm around her shoulder before saying, "We're in desperate need of a room. Please tell us you have an opening." Eva turned toward Jake. "Jake here was just telling me we have one room open. It's been a busy time." She turned back toward the couple, her gaze lingering on the crowd of reporters in front of the bed and breakfast. "I'm sorry about all of that," she said, gesturing out the window. "It's all right," Danny said, offering a lopsided smile. "We're used to it." Then she pressed her lips together as if she'd said too much. "Oh?" Eva zeroed in on that statement. "Do you find yourself in the press often?" She smiled, hoping to alleviate some of the tension. It wouldn't be the first time she'd had well-known or well-connected guests. "More than we'd like," Ted said. He winked at her as if to share an inside joke, one she wasn't too sure she understood, and then continued answering Jake's questions regarding the room. "Where are you two from?" Eva said, moving closer to Danny to let Ted handle the transaction. The large wad of cash he wielded seemed a little odd to her. "Oh, you know, Florida." She looked out the window again as if she were distracted. "You two pack light. Just a quick vacation?" Eva pressed. "Yes, just a quick one." She smiled and looked down at her phone. There was something off about the woman, as if she were hiding something. But what? Eva couldn't figure out. At least not with her cryptic answers. "How'd you hear about my bed and breakfast?" It was one of Eva's favorite questions to ask, because it let her know if her marketing dollars were doing their job while also filling in a little bit about her patrons. Honey?" Danny seemed to force the word. "What?" Ted turned around, looking between Danny and Eva. "How did we hear about the bed and breakfast?" Danny repeated. "Oh, online, I think." "Was it the article in Better Beds and Breakfasts?" "Yeah, I think that was it," Ted said. Eva caught a glance from Jake but didn't comment as he swiped the second key card and handed them over, explaining the bed and breakfast's policies to the couple before sending them on their way to the second floor and the green room. "Enjoy your stay," Eva said as they walked off. Danny sent a half-hearted smile over her shoulder, and Ted was already halfway up the first flight of stairs, leaving his wife with a large suitcase in tow. So much for chivalry. When they were gone, Eva turned to Jake with narrowed eyes. "He didn't leave a credit card on file?" "No, he insisted on paying cash. I really pressed. I know you like to have that for incidentals, but he even suggested leaving a few hundred in the safe for a deposit just in case. I finally did what you said in these situations and let it slide, but it was weird." Eva nodded. "Did you hear what he said about how he'd found this place?" "Yeah, I was wondering. You've never had a feature in Better Beds and Breakfasts, have you?" "Not yet," Eva said, turning toward the stairs as if she could assess the couple who had just walked up them. "Let's keep an eye on our guests, just in case. It could just be that they are well-known and trying to keep a low profile, but if not, I want to be aware of what they do while they're here." "You got it," Jake said, making a mock salute. She smiled down at him and pulled her new phone from her pocket. It had vibrated at least 3 times while she was talking with the new guests, and she was curious to see if Ruben had called. But when she checked, it was just a few messages from Vicky, one proposing lunch. "Hey, Jake, I'm going to go to lunch with Vicky. Are you good to stay until after lunch? Then I'll take your place?" "Sure thing," he said, grinning up at her. "Got some homework I haven't finished yet," he said with a guilty grin. "Want anything from Lucky's? Lunch is on me," she added. "You sure?" "Absolutely. Can I get a shrimp po' boy?" "You got it," she said, and headed out the door. In light of the odd type of morning she'd had, it would be nice to get away from the chaos of the inn and have some good Cajun food at Lucky's. Plus, she might be able to get a straight answer from Vicky about poor Mr. Woodhouse's cause of death. Vicky looked as if she was channeling her inner runway model as she strode toward the slightly run-down restaurant. It looked like it could use more than a coat of paint and a new sign, but Eva had been able to convince Vicky to give it a shot. In the end, after one bite of their famous crawfish étouffée, Lucky's had become their lunch destination of choice. "Hey there, darling," Vicky said, pulling off her sunglasses like she was posing for a commercial. "You look... wow." Eva blinked and took in the stunning figure-hugging red dress Vicky sported, along with 4-inch black stilettos and a Gucci purse at her hip. "I have my date tonight and Jerome called me in for some work. I won't have time to change, so I decided, why not wear it to work?" She laughed and shook her head, blonde hair swishing in front of her eyes before she tossed it away. "Oh, you poor thing," Eva said, giving her a light hug before they entered the restaurant, where the sense of seafood and fried anything greeted them like a warm hug. Vicky closed her eyes and inhaled the delightful fragrance. "I can't eat here more than once a week. My waistline will not approve. But it's just so good." Eva laughed. She knew exactly what her friend meant. But on a day like today, somehow it just felt right to relax and enjoy something delicious, even if it wasn't the healthiest thing on the menu. "What'll it be, ladies?" Grump said, shuffling up to them in a white tank top and ill-fitting jeans. He was in his 70s and had worked at Lucky's since his teenage years, or so he always liked to say. While Grump wasn't his real name, any regular knew him as such, not only as a personality trait, but as a moniker he wore like a badge. "Alligator gumbo for me," Eva said, adding, "and a shrimp po' boy for Jake, but not until we're almost done." "Sure thing." Grump made a notation on his order pad. "And you, sweetie?" he said, turning to Vicky and causing Eva to blink twice. "I can't get enough of the crawfish etouffee," she said, fluttering her eyelashes. "You bet." He marked it down. "Be right out, ladies. How about some tea on the house?" Vicky grinned and nodded, and he walked off like an infatuated puppy. "What have you done to Grump?" Eva said, gaping at her friend. "Well, I'm sure I don't know what you mean." She fumbled with her purse. "He was smitten," Eva said, allowing her chuckle to roam free. "Hardly," Vicky said, her grin widening. "You used that southern charm on him, didn't you?" Eva said. "I may have added a few extra dollars to his tip here and there, and you know a kind word goes a long way, and you've charmed Grump. I can't believe it." "I think I have," Vicky finally admitted, and both women laughed. "At least if my date doesn't work out with Sean, I always have Grump." Now they couldn't stop their laughter, and it continued up until Grump brought out their food, adding a basket of fries on the house, as he said. "You better stay on his good side," Eva chuckled as she munched a free fry. "I like the perks." "I'll do my best," Vicky said, taking a bite of her stew and rice. "Speaking of perks," Eva said, sliding a glance to Vicky, "any decision on the cause of death?" Vicky chewed thoughtfully, then swallowed. "I think I've come to a definitive conclusion." Eva waited, not wanting to push her friend to share something that she shouldn't. But Vicky seemed happy to share. "I went through some tests to check on the force that would have been needed in order for the injury to have been sustained from a fall versus from someone hitting him or pushing him with force. And?" Eva took a bite of her gumbo, savoring the spicy flavor. "It was murder." "So you were right to say that before." "Yes, but I wasn't positive, and I hate to make a guess. In fact, I won't until it's proven." "Makes sense." Eva nodded and took another bite. "How do you think it happened?" "My conclusion was that his head was not only pushed downward, but with a great amount of force, and then he collided with a tomb near where his body was found. So it couldn't have been accidental, not from falling," she rushed to explain, "but from someone pushing him and he tripped or something? No. I found post-mortem bruising on his chest, which indicates that he was shoved rather forcefully." Eva shook her head. "I'm sure that sent Jerome into a frenzy looking for motives in the killer." Vicky nodded. "Is why I was working today. He wants anything that'll give him a direction to go in, but it's hard to know. I estimate the force could be from that of a strong woman or a man. There's no definitive proof on that." "Surely a woman wouldn't have the strength to leave behind bruising?" Eva asked. "You'd be surprised. Granted, a petite woman may not have had the strength, but it's possible that a woman could be responsible. But not likely." Eva knew she was pushing her friend, but she sensed there was something Vicky might be keeping back. "I don't know definitively," she reiterated. "I would guess that it was a man who pushed Mr. Wodehouse. I don't want to rule out any suspect pool just yet, though." "I understand," Eva said, though she trusted her friend's gut instincts as she trusted her own. They took a few more minutes to eat in silence, savoring the good food, and then Vicky checked her phone. "Looks like I'm wanted back in the lab." She let out a sigh. "Why the long face?" Eva asked, pushing her nearly empty plate away and signaling for Grump to put the po' boy on for Jake. "It's just that our lovely detective friend wants answers I don't have. The lab can only work so fast, no matter how much work we put in on the weekends, and I'm afraid he'll be breathing down my neck all afternoon until I can hand him something more definitive. Surely he'll understand you can only do so much." "True, but there's also another complication." "Such as?" Eva leaned forward, intrigued. "Such as the victim's ex-wife? Well, almost ex." "What do you mean?" "Maeve Wodehouse is quite the force of nature, and she's been putting pressure on the higher-ups to have Charles's case closed and labeled as an accident. I've only heard chatter, but it sounds as if she's pushing for a quick closure. It's why I've taken so long, honestly. I want to be positive that I wasn't misreading the situation." "But she can't push something like that, can she?" Vicky smiled at Eva. "Let's just say Detective Makos doesn't let anything get in his way." Eva pondered her friend's words as she left while Eva waited for Jake's food. She'd had a few run-ins with the detective, and she'd noticed that he had a no-nonsense attitude she'd attributed to his New York roots, but she'd also seen how dedicated of a detective he was. She had a feeling if he was pushing, it was because he had a sense that there was something to be found because of the pressure to close quickly. But Vicky's comment stuck with her all the way back to the bed and breakfast, because as she'd found herself in the very middle of his investigation not too many weeks before, she'd sensed his lone wolf persona was due to more than just his decision to work alone. He was a complicated man. She'd seen that much in their few interactions. But she'd also seen a side of him that accepted he didn't have all the answers. Part of her wanted to see him again, to have him come back to a book club meeting or to grab coffee together, anywhere that wasn't a crime scene. But she'd long since found that close attachments were difficult, if not impossible, to keep when the other person was all but married to their career. And with her at the bed and breakfast, and he the new detective in town, she had a feeling they both had more than enough on their plates. Still, involving herself, no matter how thinly, in Charles Wodehouse's murder investigation might put her at odds with her desire to see the detective in a more relaxed area. But that didn't mean she would stop what the book club was planning. And who was she kidding? Every woman loved dressing up for a fancy gala. Chapter 5. Eva woke on Sunday morning feeling restless. She'd had a small dinner brought in for her staff Saturday night since they had worked so hard that weekend. Then she'd called it an early night to sit with a steaming cup of chamomile tea and read a true crime novel by her gas fireplace. The thought of who might have killed Charles Wodehouse was never far from the surface of her thoughts, though, which was propelling her to do something possibly foolish. She'd made a call that morning to the Gentlemen's Club and discovered that Maeve Wodehouse would be there to sell tickets to the benefit gala. It was exactly the answer she'd hoped to hear, and that had set plans in motion for the early part of her day. Even now she took extra time to curl the ends of her hair, apply a light layer of makeup, and dress in a nice sundress that spoke of wealth without being too showy. She did one last check in the mirror before stepping out to rush down the side path to where the car she'd ordered waited. As she did, she happened to look up just in time to see Ted Jackson peering out of the curtains at her. She had the odd feeling that he'd been watching her, but quickly shook it off as nerves. It wasn't so much that she was nervous to meet Maeve Wodehouse, but she was cautious, knowing that she wanted to meet the woman to discuss the possible murder of her husband. That would make anyone nervous, wouldn't it? Tamping down the worry that laced her thoughts, she slipped into the car, and the driver took off toward the club that overlooked the water. It wasn't a long ride, and soon she stepped out at the gates of what looked a little like a country club. When she talked with Willard about the club itself, he'd explained that it was an elegant building on a golf course that the Gentlemen's Club had taken over back in the 1920s. The golf course had its own clubhouse, but the Gentlemen's Club acted as its own entity. It made for an exclusive atmosphere that she was sure the guests liked, but also had an excellent view of the greens and the water beyond. It was the best of both worlds, for she was certain most members frequented the golf course too. "Hello," a friendly guard said, stepping out of the booth that was connected to the large gates. There was a smaller pedestrian door to the right of his station. "Can I help you?" "Yes, hello." Eva put on her best smile and hoped she'd dressed the part. "I'm interested in purchasing a ticket for the gala tonight and was told Mrs. Wodehouse was here selling them." He frowned and gave her a 1-minute signal before stepping back into the booth and lifting a phone. When he came back out, he had a bright smile. "Tickets are still on sale. Go on in and Gloria will meet you at the entrance." She was about to ask about Mrs. Wodehouse, but bit her tongue instead. She'd talk to Gloria first and see if she couldn't arrange a meeting with the benefits coordinator, especially if she was interested in donating to the benefit outside of just purchasing a ticket. Thanking the guard, she stepped past him as he held the pedestrian gate open. The walkway toward the large estate house, for that was the best way to describe it, was paved with bricks. Tall trees and vibrant green vegetation lined each side of the walkway. The scent of the ocean and a light, cool breeze rushed over to meet her as she stepped from the tree-lined path to a large open area. It was also paved with brick and made a type of half-circle with stone benches around the edge and bistro lighting fanning out from one central location at the front of the entrance. She imagined the area played background to some of the club's evening events, where there was both an indoor and outdoor space. "You must be the person looking to purchase tickets for our event tonight." A woman in her mid to late 20s rushed toward Eva with a smile and an outstretched hand. Her dark brown hair was cut short, and she wore a no-nonsense navy pencil skirt and matching blazer, along with modest blue pumps. "Yes, hello. I'm Eva Stewart. I was told I could speak with Mrs. Wodehouse about the ticket and a possible donation." She could almost see the woman sizing her up, from her expensive flats to the coach purse she'd splurged on last spring. As if finding her acceptable, the woman smiled. I'm sure that can be arranged. She's not really one to bother with tickets, but... She tilted her head to the side. Donations are more her specialty than mine. I'm Gloria. Follow me. Thank you. Gloria smiled and spun on her kitten heels before making a beeline for the front door. A gentleman in a navy suit coat that matched Gloria's opened the door for them with a smile. This is a lovely place, Eva said, hoping to gain a little more information before meeting with Maeve. Yes. Is this your first time to the club? It is. I have a friend who's a member here, Willard Smith. I don't recognize the name, but I'm new here. Do you find the name Gentleman's Club a little odd? Eva asked. She tried to get more out of Willard about the reasoning behind the name, but he'd been unable to supply her with adequate answers. Oh. Gloria stopped and turned around. We don't call it that anymore. It's been renamed the Glenna Club, but I'm sad to say it's taken quite a while for the new name to catch on. She rolled her eyes, and Eva had the distinct impression she was thinking, oh, men. I'm sure old habits are hard to break. Tell me about it, Gloria said. I've worked here for 6 months, and all the men still come in as if it's the Gentlemen's Club from the 1920s. Then, as if noticing the look on Eva's face, she rushed to add clarification. Of course the women members are doing a great job to change that, like Mrs. Wodehouse. Oh, how so? This was just the opportunity Eva had been hoping for, to find out more about Maeve before they met in person. She's a powerhouse, Gloria said, her eyes shining a little. She was the one who spearheaded the renaming contest. She's also had several successful benefits and has gotten some of the most prominent and wealthy women of Key West to join the club. It's inspiring. Eva nodded and contemplated her next statement. She had to time it just right. She does sound inspiring. But her name is so familiar. She feigned contemplation. Was she mentioned in the papers recently? Rounding a corridor that looked as if it led to offices, Gloria slowed and turned to face Eva. The look of sadness in her eyes seemed genuine. I wasn't going to say anything, but Mrs. Wodehouse's husband just died a few days ago. Eva put on her best look of shock. Really? How terrible. It really is. She's been quite broken up about it. But she's here now? Gloria looked back with admiration. She made it clear that she had to be here. She said the benefit for the natural wildlife of Key West is more important than anything, and she couldn't let the fundraiser go just because of her own personal life. But between the two of us, I think she needed something to focus on, you know? Eva nodded. I can imagine. This way, her office is right over here. Eva couldn't help the look of surprise, but the young woman had already turned around. Maeve had an office at the club? Did that mean she was employed there? Or was she simply such a high-paying member that she received special benefits? Or... Her thoughts were cut off as Gloria ushered her into the lavishly furnished office that was decorated with a distinct modern flair. Behind a large glass desk sat the woman Eva guessed was Maeve Wodehouse. She looked exceptionally polished in a cream pencil skirt and blazer with a brilliant royal blue shirt. Gold jewelry wrapped around her wrist and her neck, and she wore large diamond earrings. Her dark blonde hair was wrapped up in a French twist, and her overall look said she wasn't fazed by much. Hello, she said, her voice deeper than Eva would have imagined. You must be Mrs. Townsend. Thank you, Gloria. The young woman practically bowed out of the room and left with a soft click of the door. Actually, it's Ms. Stewart, Eva said, accepting the light handshake the woman offered before gesturing to one of the 2 leather chairs facing her desk. To what do I owe the honor, Miss Stewart? Gloria mentioned something about a donation. Eva had read on the club's website all about the wildlife charity that they were raising the money to support, and while she already donated a substantial portion of the bed and breakfast's revenue toward charities of her choosing, she had no qualms supporting this charity as well, especially if it meant that she had a chance to speak with a murdered man's widow. Yes, I just love... She faltered for a moment. Wildlife. It was true, but she knew how disingenuous it had sounded. That's wonderful, Maeve said, as if she hadn't noticed the awkward nature of their exchange. How much can I put you down for? Eva blinked. That was it? She wasn't even going to try and convince her of its worthy cause, or... Ava's eyes narrowed at the woman's head bent over a book in front of her. She had to find a way to bridge the gap, to get Maeve talking, but she wasn't sure how best to do that. If they talked about the wildlife refuge, it was likely she would get a packaged explanation of the benefits of supporting the cause, but she wanted something more personal. Ava's gaze traveled the room. There were hardly any personal touches added, but she did notice one picture of Maeve and Charles. The image was a shock to her, seeing the man she'd found dead at the cemetery, alive and smiling next to a younger version of the woman sitting in front of her. Then she glanced to a side table and smiled. "I'm sorry, but is that Machu Picchu?" Maeve looked up and blinked rapidly several times. "Yes, my husband took me there for our 5-year anniversary." "How exotic," Eva said with a smile, and then pressed forward into the more difficult territory. "Your husband looks familiar." Maeve sniffed. "You may have seen him in the news. He was found dead in the cemetery the other day." Now Eva had a choice. Admit that she'd been the one to find him, or act as if this was new information. While she disliked lying on all counts, she had a sense that it was better for her involvement to remain unmentioned. "How tragic. I'm so sorry to hear that." Maeve sniffed again and dabbed at the corners of her eyes, though Eva couldn't see evidence of tears. "It was a terrible accident, nothing more." That was an interesting thing to say when she knew the ME had classified it as non-accidental, but of course she couldn't admit to knowing that. "When did it happen?" Maeve met her gaze with a questioning one of her own. Well, it was Thursday morning." "I'm assuming you weren't there," Eva said. Now Maeve looked suspicious, and Eva frantically searched for a reason for her question. "I mean, I didn't know if you were visiting the cemetery together and something happened." "Oh." Maeve seemed to accept her reasoning. "No, I was at home watching a movie." "A movie?" Eva couldn't help the question. It sounded odd, especially considering the time. What woman with endless options like shopping or coffee dates spent the morning watching a movie? "It may sound strange," she continued, as if sensing Ava's disbelief, "but I'm a big movie buff." Eva wasn't sure she believed the woman and decided to risk one more question. "You were watching alone?" "Why do you ask?" Now Maeve looked more than suspicious. She looked as if she were close to throwing Eva out. "I always enjoy watching movies with others," Eva said, even though she knew the response was beyond lame. "Anyway, I'd love to make a sizable donation to your benefit." She hoped the mention of money would alleviate at least some of the obvious wariness the woman now showed on her face. "What is it you do, Miss Stewart?" Eva offered a light chuckle. She'd need to prove her background if this was truly to move from the rocky ground she'd brought them to. "I run the Keys bed and breakfast." She turned up the wattage on her smile. It was time for pulling out the stops. "But that's just a hobby. I've been left with a rather sizable inheritance. I find joy in discovering new ways to support good causes with my money. I'm sure you understand." And just like that, Maeve Wodehouse was back in business form, as if the odd questions hadn't even happened. "Well, that is lovely, Miss Stewart. Let's talk numbers." Chapter 6. The evening air was cool, but not uncomfortable, as Eva stepped from the rented black luxury car and onto the same bricks at the entrance to the Glenna Club. The sun was close to setting, and she admired the glowing lights amidst the sound of clinking champagne glasses as attendees mingled among tall round tables that filled the bricked half-circle. She picked up the hem of her long sheath gown. The navy blue color was so dark it almost looked black, but the sheer fabric overlay, dotted with sparkling rhinestones, made her think of the night sky. It was the reason she'd chosen this dress in the first place, and she was glad she finally had an occasion to wear it. A young man at a small table covered in a white tablecloth accepted her ticket and welcomed her to the event, offering her the number of her seat inside. She took it, slipped it into the small clutch she carried, and then made her way toward the doors. Everywhere she looked, there were men in tuxedos and women in elegant gowns, talking and laughing. Pockets of conversation murmured all over, and of course there were a few lone wolf types who were either in search of networking connections or who were too socially anxious to mix and mingle. Eva felt a little like an outsider as she walked among the groups, uncertain what her first move should be. After her conversation with Maeve earlier that day, she felt certain that there was something else going on with the woman. When she entered the ballroom area, she was surprised to see there was an area left open for dancing. It was surrounded on 3 sides by large circular tables where they would all enjoy their meal tonight. Eva glanced across the room, hoping to see a familiar face. Instead, she spotted 2. Willard and Bonnie, both dressed elegantly, chatted with several other couples a few feet away from the hors d'oeuvres table. She laughed as Bonnie physically slapped Willard's hand away from what looked like a miniature puff. She continued her perusal of the room and caught sight of Vicky on Elijah's arm. Her friend was stunning in a floor-length emerald green gown that wrapped up and around one shoulder, with the extra fabric draping down her back in an elegant swath. Next to her, Elijah cut an impressive profile in a dark suit that wasn't quite a tuxedo, but was just as debonair. He never did anything the traditional way, but he always looked fantastic. The only members of her book club she couldn't locate were Geraldine and Kay. She'd heard from Kay earlier that afternoon that Pete had to leave for a dog grooming convention a day earlier than expected, but she was still planning to take Geraldine. Eva hoped they'd made it all right. A waiter walked by with a tray of glasses, and she accepted some of the bubbling liquid, taking a sip and then breathing in deeply. She was wasting time standing there, but she needed to make sure that the conversation she did enter would hopefully be profitable. She started to circle the room when she saw a gathering of women off to the side. There were 5 of them, and they all seemed to be slightly younger than Eva. She got close enough to listen in, and, sure enough, they were discussing the death of Maeve's husband. Pulling together all the gumption she could muster, she stepped up to the circle and put on a conspiratorial look. "Did I hear you talking about Charles Wodehouse?" She kept her voice low, and the women opened the circle for her right away. "Yes," one woman said. She wore a tightly fitted black dress, and her bleached blonde hair was done up with extra poof in the front. "We were just saying how tragic it is and how odd that this benefit wasn't postponed." "It is so strange," another woman with black hair and a bright pink dress agreed. "I mean, it happened 3 days ago, and not a word from Maeve on canceling." "Maeve's his wife, right?" Eva pretended to play dumb, and the girls nodded. "But I heard that his wife was seeking a divorce." Another woman who looked less interested in the gossip but hadn't left the circle rolled her eyes. "There was a lot of back and forth. One minute she wanted a divorce because of the attention Charles had been sending elsewhere, if you know what I mean. The next minute I heard they were talking about reconciling." "Me too," a mousy girl in a gray dress added. "But who knows? I heard that from Maeve herself." "I doubt they would have gotten back together if Stephanie had anything to say about it," the first blonde woman said. She was obviously the instigator of the group. "Who's Stephanie?" Eva asked. "See that girl in the red dress?" The blonde indicated a woman standing alone by the drink table in a stunning floor-length red dress. "That's Stephanie Arthur, otherwise known as Charlie's mistress." "Camilla," the woman in the gray dress said. "Be nice." "It's a fact, Jane. I'm only stating a fact." Eva noted the woman's features so she'd be able to recognize her again, and then turned back to the group just as the music faded out. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention," the MC said. "We have our hostess, Maeve Wodehouse, here to give you a little information on the event tonight. Then we'll have you take your seats for the dinner." Maeve walked up the steps in a black gown that seemed subdued to Eva, at least from what she'd seen of the woman earlier that day. "Oh, great. Another speech about her charity," the woman closest to Eva said. It was the woman who'd seemed uninterested in the gossip before. "I'm Anna, by the way." "Hello, I'm Eva," she said, smiling at the woman as Maeve talked about the wildlife refuge. "Have you come to these events before?" Anna sighed. "My husband is a member of the club. I come, but I'm really only here for the food." She flashed a chagrined look. "I can understand that. What about you? Husband around?" "No, I'm not married. I actually just met with Maeve today about supporting the wildlife refuge. Sorry if you want to listen." Anna indicated Maeve with a wave of her hand. "It's all right, I heard it all today." She tried to look as if she was commiserating with Anna, hopeful that the woman might open up more. "Do you know Maeve, then?" "Yes, a little. She's been at every charity event I've attended, but I've only been over to her house once. It was a long time ago, but it was for her son's 16th birthday or something. I think she literally invited anyone she'd ever met." Anna gave a mirthless laugh. She has a son? Eva couldn't help the question that just tumbled out. Yes. See those men over there? Anna nodded toward a group of 5 young men who were whispering rather loudly during Mavis's speech. Xavier Wodehouse is the one in the middle. Eva turned and eyed the man Anna had pointed out. She could see the resemblance to Maeve in his sandy blonde hair and smile, but she couldn't picture Charles in the more chiseled features and narrow-set eyes. Just as she was looking away, he met her gaze and flashed a dazzling smile. "Oh, he caught me," Eva said with a light laugh, making sure to turn away. "Well, he's—" Anna pursed her lips. "How do I put this delicately? Quite the ladies' man, but more than that, he's like a heat-seeking missile for money. I'd watch your step with him." Eva turned to Anna with raised eyebrows. "How so?" "He's dated several women many years his senior, and all of them have treated him to a lifestyle he's obviously become accustomed to. I wouldn't put it past him to wrangle one of his rich widows into marriage someday just to make his way into their inheritance." She shivered. "You would think his parents would have already seen to his own inheritance," Eva noted. "I suppose that's true. The rumor is that he's got a trust fund. He receives a monthly stipend, but he won't be able to touch any of it until he turns 40 or something like that, so I hear. I think it's about making him prove his sustainability or something." Anna gave a careless shrug of her shoulders. "I wonder how he'll make it now that Daddy is gone. Pardon me, don't mean to speak ill of the dead." Eva could tell there was no love lost between Anna and the Wodehouses. "The stipend would continue, wouldn't it?" Eva said, avoiding passing judgment on the woman's opinion. "True, but I've never known Charles to deny his son anything he wanted, stipend or not, so it'll be a bit of a wake-up call." Maeve wrapped up her speech, and Eva made her excuses to leave the circle. Though she detested gossip, the information she'd gained there was invaluable, and now it was time to put some of it to good use. She was going to find Stephanie Arthur and have a talk with her about Charles Wodehouse. When Eva had made it halfway across the room toward intercepting Charles's mistress, dinner was announced, and her plans were changed for her. Her only consolation was that she guessed Stephanie Arthur wouldn't leave until dinner was over, and Eva would have a chance to talk to her before she left. Her ticket had directed her to a table near the middle, and she'd made small talk with the people around her, a dentist and his wife who believed strongly in supporting the wildlife refuge, along with a lawyer and her accountant husband. She'd actually gotten into a lengthy discussion with the lawyer using her background of growing up with a lawyer for a father, and the dinner time had passed by quickly and deliciously. When dessert was finally being picked up from the tables and the coffee service wheeled in, most guests began to rise and mingle again. It gave Eva the perfect chance to slip away from her table mates and search for Stephanie. She'd just spotted Kay and Geraldine when she caught sight of the mistress making her way toward the restrooms. It wasn't an ideal place to talk, but it would be easier to strike up a conversation in a setting where most women found a reason to congregate. Eva pressed her clutch to her side and began walking toward the restrooms when she felt warm fingers on her arm. "Excuse me," a deep voice said. She turned to find dark blue eyes staring down at her. It was Xavier Wodehouse, and he was even more handsome up close. Granted, he was at least 20 years or more her junior, but given the way he was looking at her, she wasn't sure she'd be able to tell. She remembered Anna's words about him seeking out older, wealthy women, and almost laughed at the thought that she fit into that category. Have we met?" she said, playing innocent. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." His smile flashed a brilliant white. "I'm Xavier Wodehouse. My mother is the patron of this event tonight. It's lovely to meet you." "And you are?" His grin widened as if he was enjoying this cat-and-mouse game. "Eva. Just Eva." She could guess at what he was doing. Meet women at benefit dinners, find out who they are and how much they're worth, and kindle a relationship with them. Or was it more with their money? "Just Eva," she said, flashing a secretive smile. She didn't want to play into his hands, and yet she couldn't help the thought that perhaps she could gain valuable information from the man before her. "Well, Just Eva, how are you enjoying the benefit tonight? Do you work with your mother?" He seemed taken aback by her comment. "No. Why?" "You'd make a good salesman." He laughed, the sound low. "Thank you, I think. What brings you to this benefit specifically? I've never seen you before at the club." True, this is my first time attending one of these functions. She considered what information to share in order to create a semblance of trust, but also to avoid looking as if she were falling for his charms. I'm passionate about wildlife and thought to expand my charitable giving. She saw a flash of something behind his eyes. What else are you passionate about, just Eva? He gave her a look that could only be described as smoldering. Well, she began, but then someone cleared his throat next to her. She turned to look at the intruder and just barely managed to hold in her gasp. It was Detective Jerome Makos. Hello, Xavier, the detective said. May I borrow your date for a moment? Will you bring her back? Xavier's grin was wicked. I'm not his date, Eva said a little too quickly. It'll only take a moment, Jerome said. Hurry back, Xavier said, and turned to the group next to them. Jerome took a few steps away, and Eva followed him, concerned that he'd caught on to what she and the club were doing already. She couldn't help but think of what Vicky had said, that he wouldn't let anyone get in his way. Did that mean Eva? Do you know who that is? He said, completely shocking her. What? That man. He thrust a finger toward Xavier's back. Do you know who that is? Eva narrowed her eyes. Was this a trick question? Yes, I know who he is. Then what are you doing with him? Now she frowned. Having a conversation? He's notorious for dating wealthy older women and suckering them out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Is that concern, detective? Eva said, trying and failing to hold in her smile. What are you doing here anyway? Her earlier worry resurfaced, though she was somewhat relieved to discover that he hadn't sought her out because he guessed what she was up to. I'm attending a benefit dinner. It was his turn to narrow his gaze at her. Why don't I feel like that's the whole truth? You do know who is putting this on, don't you? Is it a hobby of yours to play these guessing games? Yes, I know who is putting this on, and I know that I was speaking with her son. Eva? He paused, his gaze peering over her shoulder. Is that Geraldine? Eva felt her stomach clench. Now was a good time to get away from the all-too-perceptive detective. One other member of the club in attendance wasn't too much of a coincidence, but if he saw them all... Well, thank you for the warning, Jerome. It was very kind of you. She flashed a smile at him. But I'm going to get back to my conversation. This drew his attention right back. Really, Eva, he's not a good guy. There were so many things she wanted to say to him, that she was well aware of the young man's reputation, and she was not one to fall for a man, no matter how handsome or smooth he was, if there wasn't a genuine interest. But for now, she simply needed to throw him off before he caught on to her scheme. I'm aware, and at the moment, it doesn't bother me. She winked and turned back to Xavier, who immediately dropped his conversation to fully focus on her. Hope you're not in trouble with the law, he said with a devilish grin that said otherwise. Not at all. Good, because I was about to ask you to lunch tomorrow. Eva caught Jerome staring at them. He'd only moved a few feet away, but while his attention was on her, he wasn't looking for the other members of the club. You know what, Xavier? She met the young man's gaze, thinking inwardly that he'd never have a chance with her, no matter how debonair he was. I think lunch would be lovely. Chapter 7. Eva sat with her feet in the small hot tub to the side of the pool. Being a Monday, most of the weekend guests had checked out or were in the process of leaving that day, which left her the oasis of her backyard to herself. The odd couple, the Jacksons, still hadn't checked out and had extended their stay a few more days, stating that they weren't ready to leave paradise yet. It sounded believable, but Eva still got a peculiar feeling from them. It was as if they were hiding something. Nonetheless, she hadn't seen them much since they'd checked in, so she put them out of her mind. Today, she was planning on her lunch with Xavier taking up much of her time. He'd slipped his card into her hand before they'd parted ways the night before, and she'd sent him a text on the car ride home to make sure he had her number. Thankfully, he hadn't tried to call, and instead texted her back to arrange lunch. They'd be meeting at the restaurant on the golf course property that was attached to the Glenna Club. It was an unusual lunch date location, but he'd mentioned he would be stepping away from meetings to meet her, so she didn't give it much thought. Eva wiggled her toes in the warm water. She hadn't worn heels for that long in quite a while, and her feet had felt the ache distinctly when she returned home from the long dinner. Taking advantage of the early morning, she was happy to relax a little. Her phone buzzed next to her. Willard was calling. Hello? Hey, Eva, it's Willard. Saw your text. She sat up straighter. Do you have some information for me? Do I ever? When she'd woken that morning, she had an idea that started forming the night before. Anna had told her about Xavier's inheritance situation, but she'd never heard of anything like it before. Knowing that Willard had been a family attorney to the wealthy in Key West before he retired, she'd texted him to see if there were any favors he could pull in. It seemed he'd accomplished just that. What did you find? I was able to locate the attorney for the Woodhouses. It wasn't hard, since Bonnie knows someone who knows someone who knows him. Eva laughed. I see. I'm glad I don't have to say that again. Anyway, he's an old buddy of mine. Can't believe he's still in practice, actually, but we got to talking about the tragedy of Charles's murder. Wait, what? You didn't see? Eva blinked. See what? It's everywhere, online and in print. They say the M.E., we all know who that is, marked Charles's death as suspicious. It wasn't an accident. I wasn't aware they were making that public, Eva mused. Well, someone found out about it. Eva felt uneasy at this and wondered how Jerome was faring with his information out for all to see. Then again, perhaps it was only a matter of time. That news will put some pressure on the family, I'm sure, she mused. Yes, but we got to talking about what that meant for the family specifically. And my friend confided in me that Charles's son would not be happy about this. About what, specifically? Eva was trying to make sense of it. He put a stipulation in his will that the son won't inherit until he's 40. I'd heard that. Willard cleared his throat. You've been busy. She smiled. What else did he say, though? Well, that the son's been trying to challenge this, even while Charles was alive, but that good old Charlie kept coming back to the fact that if his son hit the prescribed net worth, he'd have no trouble claiming the rest of his money. What does that mean? If the son can show he's worth a certain amount, the age stipulation evaporates. If not, he's out of luck until he turns 40. Well, there's a twist there, too. How so? Eva swirled her feet back and forth, lost in the information Willard had uncovered. If he reaches 40 but hasn't held a job for 5 consecutive years, he won't inherit until he does. This all seems so harsh, she said, more to herself than Willard. Rich people do crazy stuff, he said with a gruff laugh. She wanted to remind him that she in fact was one of those rich people, and she'd never do something like this, but she bit her tongue. Most of her book club friends didn't know her true wealth, and she preferred it that way. I suppose they do. One last thing my friend told me, Willard said, sounding even more excited. How could there be more? What's that? Turns out that the son's been working for Charles for 4 years. Willard paused, and Eva was fairly certain it was for dramatic effect. The rumor is that Charles was going to fire him for misconduct. You're kidding. Nope. That would have put a big dent in his plans to inherit at 40. Since he's 37, he would have to wait until he was at least 42 to clear that 5-year job stipulation. You don't think his net worth would qualify him? Willard grunted. Sounded like he spends his money as fast as he makes it. Things were coming together in Eva's mind. It made sense that Xavier would try and attach himself to someone wealthy, a widow perhaps, and tie himself to her fortune if possible. It was either that or find a job and work 2 years past when he was supposed to inherit. And it sounded as if Xavier was going to be the last person to hold down a job for very long. Thanks for all this information, Willard. It's just what I needed. Welcome. I tried to dig into Charles's life with everyone we talked to last night, but they only had nice things to say about him. Not that I don't think they have dirt. His laugh was gravelly. But most people don't want to speak ill of the dead. Of course, she said, nodding to herself. I'll let you go. Bye. The silence of the backyard was broken only by the sound of the small water feature to one side of the yard, and Eva found herself wondering just who she was having lunch with. If Xavier was really angry at his father for being fired or being close to losing his job, was it possible that he'd gotten angry enough to kill the man? Could he have followed him to the cemetery and shoved him hard enough to create the fatal wound? Still, it was too early to know for certain who was to blame. While it looked as if Maeve didn't have a motive to kill her husband, if he had refused her wish to stop the divorce, would she have gotten angry enough to kill him? And besides that, was it possible there was someone else out there who had a reason to want Charles dead? At least she'd be closer to more answers after her lunch that afternoon. Still, the thought chilled her as she considered that she could be having lunch with the murderer. "You look lovely," Xavier said, his 1,000-watt smile likely costing as much as the Hermes bracelet she'd gifted to herself on her birthday last year. "Thank you," she said, accepting his light kiss on the cheek. It was over the top, but she could tell from how he held himself that Xavier Wodehouse was a consummate liar and could easily con most women into believing he was interested in them when all he truly cared about was their money. He led the way toward a table on the outdoor balcony overlooking the green, and she noted what she assumed was his tennis outfit. Interesting. If what he called meetings was really just him playing tennis at the club, then she could see why his father had considered firing him. "Have you eaten here before?" he asked, holding out her chair like a gentleman. "No." She looked around, glad to see many of the tables were filled with restaurant patrons. No chance of being caught alone with the obsequious young man, which suited her just fine. "Everything is good," he said, holding up his own menu as she began to peruse hers. "My treat," he said, flashing her yet another charming smile. She ran the scenario in her head. How many women had he brought here? Well, the prices weren't cheap by any means. They were lunch prices, and a far cry from a truly expensive meal. He likely brought unsuspecting women here, lured them in with a purchased meal here and there, until they found themselves footing the bill for his own pleasures. "There's no need," she said, smiling when he looked up at her expectantly. "We can go Dutch." She looked back down at the menu, but not so fast that she didn't catch his surprised expression. Fighting to keep her smile in, she settled on a steak salad and a glass of sparkling water when the waiter came to take their orders. Then she turned her gaze on the young man in front of her. "Tell me, Xavier, how are you doing?" He frowned. "Doing? I saw in the news that your father's death was ruled a murder." She frowned. "That has to be hard to take." He blinked once, then twice. I suppose I'm taking it as you would expect." Taking an older woman on a date and playing tennis wasn't what she'd expect from a grieving son, but she didn't want to be too antagonistic. Yet. "I'm sure it's hard." She softened her tone. "Are you a suspect?" She made her eyes go wide to channel an innocence to the question. "No, I don't think so." He rubbed at the back of his neck. "I'm sure you know from any crime show that family members are always the first suspects." He was beginning to look uncomfortable. "But that's just TV." She smiled. Just then the waiter showed up with an appetizer that Xavier had ordered, and he thanked the man before turning back to her. It seemed those few moments were all he needed to regain his composure. "I was questioned, I'm sure many people were, but I had no reason to kill my father." "Oh?" She spooned some of the garlic shrimp onto her appetizer plate. "I didn't," he said, sounding more defensive. "Did Anna tell you otherwise?" Now it was her turn to look surprised. "Anna? I saw you talking to her last night." Eva swallowed. Had he been checking up on her? "I was, how shall I say, intrigued by you." His devilish grin was back. "I asked around." She felt slightly relieved. "I just met her at the dinner." "So she said." He spooned his own shrimp onto his plate. "But she tends to gossip." Eva wanted to contradict him and say that she'd been the one going against the gossip, but she kept silent to see what he would say. "A lot of those ladies like to pretend they're friends with my mom, but it's all political." "I see." Eva took a taste. The bold flavor of the garlic was perfectly balanced with seasonings, and she couldn't help but take another bite. Yeah. Xavier continued without input from Eva. "My dad and I didn't see eye to eye on everything, but I wouldn't kill him." "Where were you when it happened?" she asked, hoping her question fit with the conversation. His gaze flicked to hers before going back to his shrimp. "I was actually with a friend." When she didn't reply, he looked up and caught her smile, an amused one of his own tugging the corners of his lips up. "I have many friends." He put his fork and knife down, reaching across the table for her hand. "But I'm interested in something more long-term, perhaps with you." Her eyebrows rose. "Does my boldness shock you?" She pulled her hand back from his, feigning a need to wipe her mouth. "I wouldn't call it shock." He chuckled. "And just to assure you, I'm not after your money." "My money?" Yes, I know you're wealthy. His look was sardonic. I have a very good PI at my disposal, and he checks out everyone I'm interested in. Eva swallowed. She didn't like the sound of that. She'd only just accepted the lunch date with Xavier the night before. How had his PI gotten access to information about her? He must be good indeed. And for some reason, Xavier's assurance was more threatening than she cared to admit. But I can assure you that while my father's death was tragic, Xavier continued, it's also a bit of good luck for me. Good luck? She couldn't keep the horror from her voice. Not like that, he said, holding up a hand. I just mean that I don't need to date for money, of course. Of course, she said, not convinced after what Willard had told her. Unless Xavier had found a way around the loss of his job, or had somehow gained enough net worth to trigger the issuing of his inheritance, it didn't seem that his situation would have changed. Just then, their waiter returned with their entrees, and Xavier switched topics to his very boring, very expensive hobbies. She barely got a word in edgewise, but that suited her well. Instead, she took the time to go over what she'd learned of the young man. While he was arrogant and clearly egotistical, did that make him a killer? He spoke so openly about his father's death, it seemed there was no place for guilt to hide. Then again, if he'd convinced himself that his father's death was a necessity for him to continue to enjoy the life he did, would that mask the guilt? Alleviate it completely? When she was nearly done with her salad, she replied with a vague answer to one of Xavier's questions as her attention snagged on a young woman wearing the club's uniform. It was hard to tell, since she was on the opposite side of the balcony, but it looked like Stephanie Arthur. Will you excuse me? I need to use the restroom. By the look on Xavier's face, she'd likely just interrupted something he was saying, but she just flashed him a smile and got up, making her way across the balcony. The woman who looked like Stephanie walked inside the restroom just as she was getting closer, and she followed. Her eyes took a moment to adjust once she stepped through the door, and she almost missed the woman disappear around a corner. Without really noticing where she was going, Eva turned down the same hall. She wasn't sure what she was going to say once she reached the woman, but she'd missed her opportunity to talk to her the night before and couldn't let that happen now. She made another turn and just caught the swish of blonde hair disappearing around another corner. Eva picked up her pace, her strappy sandals clacking on the tiled floor, but when she rounded the corner, she found it was to a lounge area. There were large, overstuffed leather chairs, some occupied by men drinking amber-colored liquid from glasses, and a few women sitting at tables by the windows. She froze in place, and a few eyes took her in, but most went back to their conversations. "May I help you?" a woman asked, coming forward with a thin menu she guessed was the alcohol list. I was looking for Stephanie." The woman's eyes narrowed in confusion. Noticing her uniform, it became clear to Eva. "She works here. Long blonde hair up in a ponytail?" "Oh, Steph, yeah." She turned around and scanned the area. "She might be out on the lower deck. She occasionally works the carts." "Thanks." Eva smiled and followed the woman's directions outside and down the steps. She had to hurry before Xavier sent out a search party for her, but she needed to speak with the woman. Stopping at the bottom of the stairs in the shadow of the above deck, she glanced around, finally spotting the woman talking with someone. "Excuse me, Stephanie?" she said, coming closer. Stephanie turned to look at her, confusion clear on her pretty features. "Yes? May I have a word with you?" Sure." She turned and finished handing over a pair of keys to a man, and then turned back to Eva. "You work here?" Stephanie looked confused. "Yeah." She indicated the logo on her shirt. "I won't take up much of your time." Eva swallowed, hesitating on the next part of what she wanted to say. "I wanted to talk to you about Charles Wodehouse." Chapter 8. The young woman blinked rapidly, and then her cheeks flushed with heat. Who are you? Are you a reporter? I'm going to call security and— No." Eva held up her hands, hoping to placate the young woman long enough to ask her a few questions. "I'm not a reporter. Not even close." She offered a warm smile, and the young woman took a deep breath. "I don't know anything, okay?" "Okay. I just have a few questions, I promise. Eva bit her lip. How did she explain she was looking into the death without sounding strange or like a reporter? Then it came to her. She needed to tell the truth. "I was actually the one to find him, in the cemetery." "You did?" Eva nodded. "Yes, it was awful, I bet." Stephanie pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. I actually hadn't seen him in weeks, she admitted. I had to read about his death in the paper like everyone else. But you were seeing him before? She nodded. We met here, actually. I do a lot of odd jobs around town. I work here and I nanny. Sometimes I work with a catering service. Eva frowned. I thought I saw you last night at the benefit dinner. Stephanie flushed again. Yeah, I went with another date. She looked uncomfortable. It was awful being there without Charles, though. I actually left early because I just couldn't take it. I could understand that. But Stephanie, do you know anyone who would want to hurt Charles? Her eyebrows shot up. Are you, with the cops or something? No, she shrugged. But I'm curious about what happened to cause someone to murder a man like that. She seemed to accept that answer and scrunched up her nose in thought. I don't know. I mean, nobody comes to mind. What about Xavier? She snorted a short, mirthless laugh. He's too stuck up to think about murder. Maeve? Stephanie blinked. I don't know. She looked guilty, and Eva wondered if it had anything to do with the role she played in breaking up the marriage. Then again, that was a guess on Eva's part. Stephanie pushed the same lock of hair away, but this time Eva noticed she was shaking. Was she worried about the line of questioning Eva had taken? I know this is none of my business, she continued, but where were you on Thursday morning? You mean, do I have an alibi? The young woman looked a little offended, but also a little incredulous that Eva would ask. I suppose you could put it that way. I have absolutely no reason to kill Charles. I mean, I have less than a reason, if that's a thing. I mean, he treated me well, bought me nice things, took me nice places. He even kept telling me to quit my jobs so we could spend more time together, but that didn't feel right. Why not? Stephanie sighed. Because I don't like owing anyone that much. She looked defiant. Stephanie bit the corner of her thumbnail and looked out over the green. Look, I'm around a lot of rich people all the time. Being with Charles made me feel like I belonged, but I don't, you know? I'm here to work for them, and that's it. When I figured that out, I left him. He understood, I think, and we parted company. I got nothing from his death, and it wasn't like he dumped me. And I was nannying on Thursday. I get in at 6 in the morning and have the kids until 7 at night. The Laws are a nice family, and they'll tell you I was there. Thank you for sharing all that with me, and I'm sorry. It's never easy to lose someone, even if you'd stopped seeing one another. Thanks. Stephanie cleared her throat and wiped at the corner of her eye. Her hand shook more noticeably as she brought it down. All right, I gotta go. Are you all right? She offered a half-smile. Blood sugar's low. Bye. Before Eva could stop her, the young woman rushed off through an employees-only door secured with a lock. Eva wouldn't have followed her anyway, since it appeared what Stephanie had said was the truth, but she was still no closer to solving the crime. Who murdered Charles? Eva made her way back to the balcony to find Xavier chatting up a young, pretty waitress. He quickly dropped the conversation when she came back, but it was clear he was annoyed. You were gone a long time. Saw someone I know, she fibbed. Stopped to chat. Oh. He pulled a small menu forward. Want dessert? He flashed that smile again, and Eva saw it for what it was, the look that usually got him what he wanted. Actually, she picked up her purse. I should get going. Please. He reached across the space to rest his hand on hers. Stay. Just for dessert. Eva, is that you again? And just like that, she was off the hook, though she wasn't sure how she felt about being rescued by Detective Makos twice in the same number of days. What did I tell you about Xavier Wodehouse? Jerome scolded, his hand resting lightly on her elbow as they walked through the club toward the exit. She didn't need the escort, but felt the touch was more about politeness than controlling her movement. We had lunch. It's not like we're engaged. He stopped in the middle of the room, causing a couple to walk around them with disgruntled mutters. What? Eva rolled her eyes. The detective was showing more emotion than she'd seen from him during the previous case, and it was confusing her. Never mind, I was fine. I just wanted to leave. He looked like he was going to beg you to stay, perhaps hold your hand hostage until you agreed. Don't be dramatic, she said. Then again, he wasn't completely wrong. Despite Jerome's intrusion into their conversation, she had felt as if Xavier was close to pleading with her to stay. It's not drama if it's true. He flashed a smile and then moved forward again, a light pressure at the small of her back now. I'm perfectly capable of walking out of this club on my own, thank you. I don't doubt that for a moment, he said as they stepped out into the bright sunshine. I just wanted to see if you needed a ride home. She paused, her hand going up to shade her eyes from the sun. A ride? Please tell me you didn't come all the way out here to give me a ride home. His eyes were hidden by the dark sunglasses he'd slipped on the minute they stepped outside, but she caught a tug at the corner of his lips. A near smile. No, I came here to make sure Xavier didn't swindle you out of a meal or more. His statement was bold, and he made no apologies about it. How did you know where we'd be? She could tell it wasn't the question he'd been expecting, but he conceded by shrugging his shoulders. I'm a detective. She pursed her lips. All right, I've looked into Xavier before, and I know that he spends most of his time here, whether he's working or not. I had a feeling he'd bring you to his favorite location. Good detective work. I try. He nodded toward the valet, and moments later his unmarked car was being delivered. You used a valet? She said with a smile. When in Rome. He opened the passenger side door for her, and she climbed in before she had time to decide whether or not she wanted to risk being in a car with the handsome detective. He walked around and slid behind the wheel. Back to the keys? He asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Yes, please. He pulled away from the curb and turned down the long driveway that led to the main road. Greens stretched out on both sides of the car, and she caught him admiring the view. Do you golf, detective? It's Jerome, remember? I do, she said. I've been known to spend time on a greenway now and then. Which means you're a golfer. My father said it like that, too, and he was certainly more than just a fair-weather golfer. Was he any good? I have no idea, she said with a sad smile. It wasn't something she'd have thought to ask, though now that he was gone, it was something she wished she could call and ask about, like so many other things. They rode on in silence for a few minutes before he glanced at her. I know why you were at the gala last night. The wildlife refuge, of course, she said, keeping her gaze ahead and trying not to look guilty, because she wasn't. She was only asking questions, and there was no harm in that. Was there? Is that the only reason? He said. What other reason could I have for attending a gala? I don't know, he said, sending another glance her way. Perhaps to investigate the murder of Charles Wodehouse? Investigate? Isn't that your job? She knew she was nearing the line, but Jerome seemed to be relaxed, a fact that could either worry or embolden her. She chose the latter. It is, which is why I wanted to stop by and see you. When you knew I was out to lunch with Xavier Wodehouse. He gave her a guilty-as-charged look, which only made her chuckle. Subtle, detective. I did warn you about him. And I, as a grown woman, decided to ignore those warnings and have a very innocent lunch with the son of a man whose body I happened upon in the Key West Cemetery. That is all. They pulled up in front of the bed and breakfast, and Eva was surprised at how fast the whole trip had taken. I have a feeling you're neck-deep in an unsanctioned investigation, and I'm wary of what it might mean for you. I'm not sure I understand, Eva said, facing Jerome. Just that, while Xavier's mostly harmless, he's also very fond of wealth and hasn't been cleared from my list of suspects. Has anyone else not been cleared? She asked. He opened his mouth as if to answer, then pressed his lips together in a smile. You're very good, Eva. You almost had me releasing privileged information. But no, I'm here as a kind reminder to leave detective work to the detectives. I hear you. He sat there looking at her for a long moment before replying. Why doesn't that make me feel confident I've gotten through to you? She merely smiled and reached for the door. Thank you for the ride, and don't worry, I have no interest in Xavier Wodehouse. He frowned as if that wasn't the assurance he was interested in, but then she was already stepping back and closing the door to the car. She watched as he shook his head and pulled into the light, early afternoon traffic. It was surprising to her that he hadn't tried harder to stop her from the investigation. Then again, he might not know just how much she was really looking into the whole affair. Eva chewed her lip. A small part of her felt guilty for trying to solve the mystery, but she was so very curious. It was more than a curiosity, though. More than just boredom or foolishness. There was something compelling about the reality that she'd stumbled upon the body of a man who someone wanted to kill. not to mention the fact that it was a mystery worth solving for all involved. Chapter 9. Eva typed an email response to a potential guest who wanted to rent out the whole bed and breakfast for a writer's retreat before stepping out of her cottage and locking the door behind her. Tuesday morning was busy already, flooding her inbox with emails from potential guests and quite a few news outlets. Now that the news was more widespread regarding the fact that Charles Wodehouse had been murdered, everyone wanted an interview with her. She knew that word would continue spreading, but she didn't fancy sitting down with anyone regarding the experience. In fact, she'd been scrolling the town news that morning and saw a featured piece on Xavier. It didn't mention specifics, but it didn't place him in the best light either, and the fact that it had come so close after she'd had lunch with him made her uneasy. None of the interview requests had been that specific, but they were still insistent. What would she say? It was horrible and sad? Anything more than that would be fanaticizing the experience, which would simply give her media exposure, something she did not want or need. Her inn did well for itself, thanks to her marketing in all the right areas for potential guests to find her. Besides, she was above using someone's murder for visibility, even if any press was supposedly good press. She walked up the back steps just as her phone dinged. Pulling it out of her pocket, she saw that Benita was running late. It was no problem since Eva was already up and ready to work, so she sent a quick text back letting her know not to rush and then made her way into the bed and breakfast.
"Call the cops,"
Poirot said just as Eva caught sight of two people rummaging around in her desk. "Can I help you?" Both people stood up straight, and she realized it was the Jacksons. Ted plastered on a fake smile while Danny crammed a piece of hair behind her ear. At the same time, Eva noticed she slipped her other hand, clutching a key card, into the pocket of her plaid capris. Ted chuckled, though it came out sounding a lot guiltier than she assumed he'd meant for it to. "We were looking for a spare key to our room." "In my desk?" Eva said. She couldn't help the edge to her tone because she could see clearly now that papers were mussed and her top drawer, the only one she left unlocked, was partially opened. "Yeah, we're clumsy like that," Ted laughed, but it sounded contrived. "I don't keep spare keys where it's easy for anyone to access," Eva said, coming forward. It seemed Poirot had the right idea. She was tempted to call the cops, but took a deep breath. On the off chance that her guests were telling the truth and only acting guilty because they'd been caught, she forced a smile she didn't feel and walked behind the desk. She made a point to slip past Danny so that she would have to move, and then sat down in her chair. Everything felt off, and when her hand accidentally hit the mouse, her screen came to life. Thankfully, it showed the login information, which someone couldn't get past without a password, something Jake had set up, but it was disconcerting to see that it was on. It should have been turned off from when Jake closed the night before. Again, Eva took a deep breath and tried to rationalize that it was possible Jake had forgotten. She couldn't jump to conclusions, despite how suspicious the situation looked. She went through the motions of remaking the key, but made sure the couple wasn't able to gain access to the computer's code. The most important files on her computer were protected with additional security, but she didn't want them having access to any of her files, on the off chance that's what they were after. With another forced smile, she handed over the card. "Here you are." "Thank you so much," Danny said. "We're so sorry. We just didn't want to bother you." "Next time," Eva said, standing, "bother me. I much prefer to guests going through my personal areas." Danny's smile faltered, but Ted seemed somewhat recovered and rested his arm around her shoulder. "Like we said, we're sorry. And thanks for the quick fix." Looks like breakfast is served," Eva said, noticing a wave from Anton in the doorway to the kitchen. "I hope you enjoy it." They took the exit quickly and made their way across the room to the sunroom. Eva frowned as she sat down in her chair again. She felt slightly violated, and yet she wondered if she was overreacting. It was possible the couple really had been looking for another key, and it was possible they didn't want to bother her, but it didn't feel right. Plus, didn't Danny put a key card in her pocket? Eva was fairly certain she'd seen her do that when she walked into the bed and breakfast. Even if there was a problem with the card, they'd had ample opportunity to find Anton, who made enough noise to be noticeable, in the kitchen or to come out to her cottage. Every guest room came equipped with emergency information, so they could have found a better solution than rummaging through her desk. "Pretty bird," Poirot said from his cage on the opposite side of the room. He'd been strangely quiet, but now she wondered if he'd been as flustered by the couple's actions as she had been. Perhaps his first comment about calling the cops wasn't far from the truth. "Yes, you are a pretty bird," she said, going to his cage. He did a few tricks for her. She fed him an almond, but her mind wandered to Charles's death, as it frequently did recently. It seemed that no one had a reason to want him dead, and yet he was, and it had been a murder. And, as she'd learned from reading countless novels, someone could easily say that they had no reason to want someone dead, but still have done the deed. Of the suspects she knew, who had the most motive, or any motive for that matter? She'd spoken with Maeve, though that conversation hadn't been very enlightening. She'd also met with Xavier, who suffered from a large ego, but that didn't have to translate to murder. Then there was Stephanie, but she seemed even less of a suspect. Yet that was assuming they had all been truthful to her when they'd spoken. On a whim, Eva pulled out her phone and put in a call to Elijah. He answered on the first ring. "Hey, Eva, what's up?" "I have something I'd like you to do, but you can turn me down." Elijah didn't give her a chance to explain. "Whatever you need, I'm your guy." She smiled and began to lay out the things she needed. It would be tricky, but she knew Elijah had a way of getting past people's barriers. It's why she'd thought of him for this very job. He was the kind of guy you wanted to tell things to, and she was counting on that to be of use when he went after the information he needed. When they hung up, she noted that Danny had moved into the main room. She was staring at one of the bright paintings Eva had purchased from a local artist as if it were a Monet. With eavesdropping ears nearby, Eva was thankful she hadn't given Elijah the names of the people she wanted him to meet with. Instead, she'd made sure he knew what was at stake and that she would email him the rest. He'd understood, and now she realized it was more than luck that had kept her mostly silent about the conversation. There was something off about her guests. She couldn't pinpoint what it was exactly, but she now felt as if she knew for certain they weren't newlyweds staying at her bed and breakfast for no other reason than to enjoy Key West. No, something was definitely up with Ted and Danny. After logging out of the computer, Eva pushed to stand and made her way to her secluded spot on the porch. She wanted to make the next call in relative quiet, and she couldn't trust that Danny or Ted might not be staying close to listen in. Rather than pull the curtains closed, Eva left them open and sat with her back facing the back door. It would be the only way for someone to come outside, and whoever did try to walk to the back door would have to walk past her. If they tried to come around from the front, that portion of the walkway was uncovered, so she'd also see them there. Feeling relatively confident in her security measures, Eva placed the next call on her mental list. It was time to see if she could get another face-to-face meeting with Maeve Wodehouse. Eva felt a little more like a sleuth as she waded through a sea of white tablecloths toward a back table facing the ocean, where she'd been told Maeve Wodehouse was having lunch. Eva had all but forced the woman's poor assistant to give up the details of Maeve's lunch plans, banking on the fact that the hope of a sizable donation to Maeve's charitable efforts would be worth the trip. Her hunch paid off. Now, though, as she drew closer, she saw that Maeve was not alone like her assistant said she would be. A man sat with his back to Eva. He had a hat pulled low and was hunched over so that she couldn't get a good look at his features from her vantage point. It was clear that Maeve was distressed, but not enough to warrant someone coming to her aid. The man moved a little to the side, and she saw he was writing on a notepad of some sort, his left hand scraping across the pages as he jotted something down. She drew closer, but she saw the instant Maeve's eyes met hers, the man's back stiffened, and he shoved his notebook in his coat pocket and pushed up from the table. Without so much as a farewell to Maeve, he rushed past Eva so fast she couldn't even get a proper look at his face. Only his dark brown hair had made a lasting impact on Eva. "Miss Stewart," Maeve said, using a white cloth napkin to dab at the corners of her mouth. "What are you doing here?" The woman looked as undisturbed as ever, though there was an underlying tension only visible at the corners of her mouth. The gentle sea breeze blew her short hair around her face, and she casually pushed it away. Then she held her hand out and motioned for Eva to take the now vacant seat. "I'm sorry to interrupt your meeting," Eva said, hoping to play her cards just right and get a little information on the man who had just left. "Your secretary said that you were lunching alone." "I was," she said with a light laugh. "James was just stopping by to—" She shrugged. "Update me on a few things." "James," she said. "It's nothing," Maeve said with a nervous laugh that brought a light pink tint to her cheeks. "Would you like a menu, ma'am?" a young waiter said, stepping up with a menu and wine list over his arm. "No, thank you," Eva said with a kind smile. Are you sure I can't entice you with our extensive wine list? Mrs. Wodehouse has the best taste and would advise you well, I'm sure." "Oh, Edward," Maeve said with yet another blush, this time accompanied with a girlish laugh. "You are too sweet." The young man, Edward, seemed to glow under her praise, but there was a look in his eye that Eva didn't like. The one that said he was more than familiar with Maeve's tastes. But surely she was misreading the situation, wasn't she? Eva wondered. "You run along, though. Miss Stewart is only here for a little chat." He winked at her, causing more giggles, and then Maeve turned to meet Ava's steadied gaze. "He's a charmer, that one." Her eyes followed the young man across the dining floor, and when he peeked back, she waved. Ava was shocked. Maeve's husband had just been killed. She tried her best to hide her shock at the woman's blatant flirting, but she couldn't catch her look in time. "Don't look like that," Maeve said with a dramatic eye roll. "I know he's half my age, but a woman has to have her fun, doesn't she?" Ava wasn't so sure about that, but she made a non-committal sound and the woman seemed to accept it. "Now are you here about another donation?" On the way to the restaurant, Ava had considered how she hoped to gain information from the woman. She thought of a few different ways to approach it, but it all came back to the fact that there was no reason for Maeve to open up to her. As a donor, or even just a friend, though that would be a bit of a stretch, she couldn't see a better way than the truth. So with a bit of hesitance, she tried her best to be open with the woman sitting across from her. "Actually," Ava met the woman's gaze, "I have a confession." "Oh?" Maeve forked a bite of her salad into her mouth, chewing thoughtfully. "I wasn't up front with you the first time we met, and I'm afraid the connection I have to you is less than desirable." Maeve seemed to sense Ava's tone and placed her fork on the plate, giving Ava her full attention. "Go on." "I was actually the one who found your husband's body." It took longer for Maeve to react than Ava had assumed, but finally, after blinking frantically, she seemed to come to her senses. You found Charles?" "Yes, I'm sorry. I looked into his family naturally, and when I came to see you, I was interested in your charity, so I went ahead and donated." "Thank you," Maeve said, slightly distracted. "But why are you here now?" This would be the part that Ava had to make sound believable, so Maeve wouldn't hold back information from her, but also so she wouldn't run immediately to Detective Makos with the information that Ava was looking into her husband's murder. Ava didn't want to sound nosy, nor did she want to tip Maeve off that she suspected her of having a part in her husband's death. "This may sound odd, but I can't get the image of him out of my mind," Ava began, wishing she'd taken Edward up on his offer of a glass of water. Maeve merely blinked. "I don't want to upset you," Ava rushed to say, but it was a bit like facing my own mortality. "I hope I don't sound dramatic." "No, I think I understand. I've just been curious about getting to know who he was in life. I'm sure you can understand." "I think so," Maeve said, though she looked unconvinced. "Like finding out you're so invested in the wildlife refuge and that he was a member of the the Glen Club. My friend Willard is actually a member. It's a small world." "Key West is a small place," Maeve observed. "It is. I'm sorry, but what do you hope to know from me, Miss Stewart?" Ava sensed hesitation from the woman, which was all too natural, and she knew she needed to press just a little more before she gave up. "I'd just heard that you and Charles were looking at a divorce." Ava straightened her back. "And in my quest to understand Charles, I suppose I wondered why." "I know, it's completely invasive of me," Ava rushed to say, "but you don't seem like the grieving widow." For almost a full minute, Maeve stared back at Ava without so much as a word. Ava was sure that the woman was going to make her leave, but then she shrugged and dropped her napkin on the table. "Frankly, and this might make me sound like a horrible person, but it's too hard to pretend, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that my marriage with Charles was perfect. In fact, it was far from it." Maeve looked out over the water now, but not as if avoiding Ava. It was more like she was reflecting back. "I've been the grieving widow, and I am sad he's gone, don't get me wrong, but our marriage was a sham." Ava wondered what had changed to make the woman open up like this, but she wasn't going to risk her stopping the river of information, so she remained quiet to give the woman room to share. "I'd caught Charles with several other women before the latest, Stephanie." Maeve rolled her eyes. She was young enough to be his daughter, and it was just insulting. Have you been married? Maeve's frank question surprised Eva, but she shook her head. No, I never found the right man. There is no right man, Maeve said dismissively. They all lie and cheat. But there were times when Charles could be sweet. Those were the times I was fighting to get back. So did you want to stop the divorce? Maeve looked over at her, questioning. I'd heard someone mention it. I did, but mostly because of the mess it was turning into. I also didn't want poor Xavier in the middle of it all. Eva wondered if it was that, or more that she didn't want Xavier cut out of the will. No one had said that specifically, and yet Eva got the feeling that the young man's inheritance was already on a rocky foundation. Could a divorce have caused Charles to cut out his son too? That seemed cold, but she couldn't be sure. Charles was considering my request. He'd even taken me to Boca for a quiet weekend, and things seemed as if they might be looking up. Now Maeve wiped at her eyes with a finger. The tears seemed genuine, but it was hard to tell. Maeve appeared to be well-versed in politics, even if they were just garden party ones. But he died before the divorce was final, Eva said. Maeve met her gaze now, something hard and shrewd there. To answer the question you haven't asked, but want to, I didn't kill my husband, Miss Stewart. He might have been infuriating and a lover of many women in addition to me, but none of that was worth the cost of murder. Eva inclined her head, not sure whether she could believe the woman's admission. She seemed honest, to a fault even, but there was something in her polished exterior, as well as her wandering eye, that led Eva not to trust everything she said. Instead of pressing the issue, though, she stood and thanked the woman for her honesty. Maeve merely shrugged, sipping more of her wine before going back to her salad. Apparently, conversation about her late husband wasn't enough to deter her from lunch. On the way out, Eva caught sight of Edward filling a tray with silverware rolled up in napkins. She moved toward him, a smile in place by the time he looked up. "Can I help you?" he asked. He had a practiced smile that told her he made good tips from his charming nature. "I was just wondering if you knew the gentleman who Mrs. Wodehouse met with before I got here. She mentioned his name, but, so typical of me, I forgot what she'd said, and now I'm too embarrassed to go back." Eva gave a look to show her embarrassment, and his understanding smile back held the promise of a name. "Oh, sure. I think his name is James. He's a private investigator, right?" "Oh, yes." Eva tapped her temple. "That's it. James—" She feigned searching for his last name. "James Hardy, I want to say. Maeve, Mrs. Wodehouse, mentions him a lot." "Of course," she said, nodding. "Thank you again, Edward." She slipped a $10 bill into his hand, and his smile brightened. "Any time." This time he winked. He was pushing it. She quickly turned away and made her way to the front of the restaurant, where the doorman hailed a car for her. In the sleek interior of the black car, Eva thought through what she'd learned as the driver took her home. The lunchtime traffic was backing up, so she knew it would take a little longer than normal, though she didn't mind pondering what she'd learned. There wasn't much love lost between Maeve and Charles, yet she did seem to want to patch things up. Still, if that was only for the sake of her son's inheritance and what Eva assumed was also her own financial stability, then wouldn't it stand to reason that having Charles permanently out of the way would also accomplish the same thing? Head spinning, Eva closed her eyes, resting her head on the headrest just as her phone buzzed. Reluctantly opening her eyes, she pulled her phone out to see a text from Vicky. It was to the Murder Mystery Book Club group. "Vicky, urgent meeting at Geraldine's tonight, 7 p.m. It took everything within Eva not to text back and ask for details, but she knew that her friend would explain everything that night. Eva also had to admit that it was good timing on all fronts. She had news to share as well. Namely, that they couldn't exactly cross Maeve off the list of suspects, though Elijah's information would confirm that for sure. Chapter 10. The soft sounds of an old jazz album played in the background as Eva took a glass of iced tea from Geraldine and followed her to her back porch. Eva had come just a bit early to help the older woman set up for their impromptu meeting that night. While Geraldine definitely had the space on her large back porch, it always took a little time to get the chairs set up in a conducive manner. "Thanks for coming," Geraldine said. Her flowing dress radiated brightness with a color mixture of orange, lime green, and hot pink. She'd paired it with a white kimono that hit just above her ankles. Her bare feet made Eva smile as she moved a chair into place. "Of course. I'm anxious to hear what Vicky has to say." "You don't know either?" she asked. "No, I decided not to bother her while she was at work, but I'm dying to know what it is." Geraldine laughed. "Poor choice of words, my dear." Eva scrunched up her nose. "Good point. Hello, ladies," Elijah said as he stepped onto the porch. He pulled off his messenger bag and sunglasses. "Let myself in, hope you don't mind." His grin made his eyes squint in a kind way, and Eva knew Geraldine wouldn't mind if he were to rob her blind. That was just Elijah. You couldn't help but like him. "Of course not. Will you grab the plate of cookies from the kitchen?" she asked. When he was gone, Geraldine turned to Eva with a conspiratorial whisper. "It's a new recipe, sweetened only with dates. Bonnie gave it to me. Let me guess, you don't want me to say anything to Willard." Geraldine winked. "You got it." Soon the back porch was filled in. Pete and Kay had brought a new little dog of indeterminate breeding that mostly sat on Pete's lap and snored, while Willard positioned himself near the cookies. Elijah took the seat next to Vicky, and Eva and Geraldine shared a wicker love seat. Everyone was chatting, but Eva saw Vicky motion for her to start the unofficial meeting, something that made Eva want to laugh. It wasn't really a book club meeting, and yet they still seemed to need her to officiate. Then again, she seemed to be the one spearheading the investigation, not so much for lack of interest from the rest, but because she was their leader, in book mysteries and real-life ones too. "All right, everyone," she said. They quieted down and turned their attention to her. "We've got a few updates." She met Elijah's nod with a smile and looked over at Vicky. "I think there are 3 of us with news, and—" "I've got something too," Willard said, drawing the gaze of the group. "Just did some digging at the club," he added with a shrug. "Wonderful. Who wants to go first?" When no one volunteered first, she decided to break the ice. "How about I share what I discovered about Maeve and Xavier?" Everyone nodded, so she explained her meetings with both and how she'd even met with Stephanie, though the conversation was brief. All in all, they each seemed to have alibis, but I asked Elijah to do some extra digging. And dig I did, he said, taking her offered conversational baton and running with it. "I ended up befriending Xavier on the tennis courts. I've been known to have a mean backswing," he said with a wink to Vicky, who blushed at the attention. "But turns out Xavier is more of a water cooler talker than I would have expected." Eva nodded. She would have guessed that about him. "We got into a conversation about his father's murder. The fact it was in the papers was very helpful for that. And he said it was freaky. His word, not mine. He also went on to tell me that he'd been out all night." Elijah coughed. "If you know what I mean." "Did you find out with who?" Eva asked. "I did. He'd mentioned her name, but decided to run to the bathroom, and, well, I sneaked a peek in his phone contacts." "How did you get in?" Pete asked, looking more than a little horrified. "He must have a passcode." "I have my ways," Elijah laughed at Pete. "He only had a 4-digit passcode, and it was easy to remember when I saw him punch it in earlier. Anyway, I didn't do anything other than get the woman's full name and number, likely something the police already have." Pete still looked a little green, but nodded his head, no doubt appreciating Elijah's strategy. "I called her when I left the courts and found out that they were together." "Do we want to know how you managed that?" Pete asked. Elijah shook his head. "Best left to the imagination." "So he has an alibi," Eva muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Yes, but I did check up on Maeve's alibi as well," Elijah continued. "I know you met with her, and it seems like she has no reason to want Charles dead, but I was able to stop by the house and speak with the butler." "Please tell me you did not impersonate a detective," Kay said. She looked as green as Pete now. "No," Elijah grinned, holding up a hand. "A reporter." A few chuckles went around the circle. "I just said I was following up on what she'd already told the press, that she was watching a movie with him. It was the butler who answered the door." "And?" Willard said. "It's hard to say whether I fully believed him, but he verified that she was. He wasn't watching with her, he made that very clear, but he did say she was there the whole time." Eva muttered. "What?" Vicky said, looking at her. "It's just strange. Elijah, can I ask an odd question?" "Of course." "Was the butler handsome?" A few snickers went up around the circle, but Elijah just shrugged. "I guess so. I mean, he was definitely younger than I would have thought for a position like that." You know, I think of a butler as always older and very formal, but this guy was probably mid-30s and, a lady may think he was good-looking. What are you getting at, Ava? Kay asked. Just that when I met with Maeve, she was making eyes at the waiter, and I wonder if it wasn't just Charles who had a wandering eye. Do you think the butler was lying about being with her because they're having an affair? Vicky guessed. That, or... Ava shrugged. Or they weren't exactly watching a movie. Well, one of those gives her an alibi, while the other's more worrisome, Willard pointed out. True, Ava said. I don't know, Elijah said. It seemed like he was hiding something, but whether it was an affair with his employer or that he was lying, I'm afraid the police will have to figure that out. What was your news, Willard? Vicky said. It was clear that she wanted to go last in the circle of sharing. Not as much as you two, he admitted with a grim smile. But I did ask around at the club. Apparently Charles was always complaining about his son, like the fact that Xavier was better at spending money than making it. And then the reality that he was going to be let go of his job with his father. Guess that wasn't sitting well with him. He seems to have a good motive, Pete said. If I was going to inherit as much money as it seems like Charles was worth, I would hate the thought of being so close and then being dropped, you know? Everyone nodded. But his alibi, Elijah said, reminding everyone of what he'd found out. How credible is she, though? Geraldine asked. She'd mostly been observing the conversation up until that point. It sounds as if there are good alibis aplenty, but they all could have holes. Well, before we go any further, Vicky said, I think you should know about this next thing. It may inform us about who we're looking at, and it may not. Yes, please, tell us your news, Elijah said, looking overly anxious, which got a smile out of them all. The reason I called you all here tonight, and thank you for hosting Geraldine, is that I had to revise my original assessment of how Mr. Wodehouse died. But please know, this information is not public knowledge. Heads nodded as the porch grew silent. The only sound was the night insects humming about. What do you mean, revise? Willard finally asked. I mean that I uncovered another reason he died, not just the head wound. But I thought you said it was clear that someone had pushed him, Kay asked. They did, but I didn't account for the fact that he could have already been fallen when he hit his head. I'm confused, Pete said. Ava started to feel tingles race up her arms. So what really happened? I found something I'd overlooked. A needle mark. It turns out that Charles was injected with a fatal dose of insulin. The group was silent at this revelation. It appears to me now that he received this dose and likely suffered effects such as dizziness, blurred vision, rapid heartbeat, and more, but I have a theory. No one interrupted her as Vicky formed a word picture for them. I think that this person, whoever was trying to kill him, injected him thinking it would work quickly, but when it didn't, they panicked and shoved him, which created the injury to his head, the fatal wound. Gruesome, Elijah said with a fake shiver. It is, but it would account for why I found two causes of death. If he hadn't been shoved down, the insulin would have killed him, Ava asked. Most likely, yes, Vicky agreed. But there is the chance someone could have found him in time and gotten him help. So, Willard said, no doubt picturing the cemetery he and Bonnie had walked around. They were able to inject him, and when he didn't die immediately, they pushed him. It seems that way. I've theorized that he might have been kneeling because the injection site was near the back of his neck, and I found grass and dirt stains on the knees of his pants. Then, after the injection, he likely stood up, shocked by the poke to his neck. The murderer waited, and when it was clear Charles was struggling, but not yet dead, they did the next thing. Everyone burst into conversation about this possibility, sharing theories as to who could have done it, but while speculations flew around the room, Ava slipped into silence. Finally, it seemed that the others noticed and grew quiet too. What is it, dear? Geraldine asked. Ava blinked out of her thoughts, only to find her circle of friends watching her. They wanted to know what had caused her to go silent. She'd been thinking of a way around what she'd concluded, and yet she couldn't find one. It all pointed to a motive. Finally, she knew she needed to share her thoughts. I'm not saying this as an accusation, she prefaced. But when I talked with Stephanie Arthur, I discovered one thing that takes her back to the top of our list. She has an alibi, though, right? Pete pointed out. She was babysitting, but I didn't check into it. I can do that, Elijah said with a kind smile. Eva nodded. Do that because this is a little too coincidental to not be worth checking into. What is it? Vicky asked. Eva met the gazes of her friends. Stephanie Arthur, the woman Charles had an affair with, is a diabetic. Chapter 11. Eva couldn't sleep. She'd been lying in bed since the clock hit 4 that morning, and while she was tired, she couldn't help but toss and turn rather than going back to sleep. When it was clear she wasn't going to get any more rest anytime soon, she decided to get up and get a start on her day. Taking advantage of the early hour, she slipped into a swimsuit and did laps in the pool, enjoying the energizing temperature and the physical exercise. Then she took a hot shower, made a large breakfast, and spent an hour reading by the gas fireplace in the small living room area of her one-bedroom cottage. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, she was getting ready to head over to the main building when she caught sight of a news alert on her phone. It was a local news station, and she tapped on the alert to read the article. As she did, something about the headline struck her. Local man found dead in cemetery, and not on purpose. It was ironic, if not a bit cringeworthy, and was no doubt chosen to draw in readers to click on the article. Somehow it hinted at something in the back of her mind. But what was it? She perused the article, only getting a few sentences in, when she read something that made her blood run cold. It was an explanation of the fact that Charles Wodehouse had died from an overdose of insulin, in addition to his head wound. The rest of the article was a lot of speculation as to who might have killed Charles, but nothing aside from the double death cause leapt out at her. When Vicky's number appeared on her screen, Eva wasn't surprised. "Did you see it?" Vicky said, breathless. "I did, but how—" "You trust everyone at our meetings, don't you?" "Completely," Eva said without hesitation. She knew that no one would have betrayed Vicky's confidence. So then how did the Key West Daily get a scoop like this? A shiver ran up her spine. "I'm sure Detective Makos is going to be furious." Vicky sounded worried. "It's going to be okay," Eva assured her. "We'll get to the bottom of this. Until we do, just do your job." "Okay." She didn't sound as sure as Eva would have hoped, but it was all she could ask for. "Bye, darling," Vicky said, and then hung up. Eva turned and was walking up the steps of the main building when another thought hit her. Not only was the supposedly unknown information leaked in a shocking way, the thing that had bothered her was coming back. It was the cemetery. Yes, she'd found Charles there, and she knew many people who walked around or through it at times. It wasn't unusual. But why had Charles been there? Ava's hand stilled on the back door handle. Why indeed? It was one thing to take a morning walk, but she knew from Elijah's research that Maeve and Charles had an estate a few miles away from the cemetery, so he would have had to walk there, taken a car, or been dropped off. He hadn't looked like a man who walked long distances, and she was fairly certain that Detective Makos would have looked into him being dropped off, but none of that was as interesting to her as why Charles had been to that specific location in the cemetery. Shaking her head, Eva retraced her steps. She'd been so foolish to not even check out the location where Charles had been found. Switching her strappy sandals for a pair of tennis shoes, Eva took the side path and made her way to the main street. From there, she took the familiar route to the cemetery. It was eerie to think that this was the route she'd taken when she'd found the body. And she also wondered if the section where he'd been found would still be blocked off. Then again, it was likely they'd finished their investigation into the area, and it would have been reopened to the public. She turned down a shaded street, the temperature already rising to a balmy 70 degrees for the early morning, and saw that the main gate was open as usual. Turning in, she paused a few steps from the main gate. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt like she was being followed. In a quick motion, she spun in a circle to look behind her, but there was no one there. Strange. She had a good sense of these things and wasn't usually wrong. Then again, not being followed was preferable, and she was happy to be mistaken. Picking up her pace, Eva made her way down the paved path that led through the center of the cemetery. She knew the way she always walked like the back of her hand, but still she worried if she'd be able to find the area where Charles had died. She'd been understandably distracted when she'd found him, and while she knew the cemetery, it was a bit of a labyrinth. After thinking for a few moments, she suddenly remembered. A flowering bush had been off the main path, and that's what had made her turn in that direction. Then she'd seen the feet. Her nose wrinkled at the unpleasant memory. As she went a little farther, she saw the same flowering tree in the space where she saw the feet. It drew her off the path and toward the above-ground tombs, the largest of which had hidden most of Charles Woodhouse's body. And that memory brought with it another piece of the puzzle. She remembered his very expensive shoes. There was no way he had walked there in them. She took a few more steps and slowed as she came around the corner, half expecting to see the body still there, though she knew that was a foolish thought. The grass was clear of a body, but also clear of any evidence. Aside from the rust-colored stain on the corner of the lower tomb where Charles had hit his head, there seemed to be no evidence that... Her sharp eyes caught sight of something. Stepping past where Charles's body had been, she came around the other side to see that a tomb had been broken into. It was clear that someone at the cemetery had tried to cover it up for now, but the cardboard they'd used had fallen away to show a gaping hole in the cement. The darkness of the hole was unsettling, but the presence of the hole in the first place was even more troubling. No doubt the police had seen this. Had Charles been the one to break in? And if so, why? She closed her eyes for a minute and tried to recreate what she'd seen when she'd found him. He'd been lying on the ground, his head... No. She squeezed her eyes more tightly closed. She didn't need to remember that part. One hand had been flat on the ground, and the other lay across his chest. As best she could remember, it hadn't looked like he'd had concrete dust on his hands or his clothes. Though her memory was not something she'd rely on if a court of law depended on it. Eva stilled. Had that been a footstep? There it was again. It sounded like someone walking, but from the direction of the tombs, not on the main walkway. Her heart began to pound more forcefully in her chest. She tried and failed to calm it down, even though it seemed foolish for her to be worried. Nonetheless, Eva wasn't about to take any chances. She immediately ducked down below the tomb beside her. It was a foolish whim, but perhaps not. Then she shuffled around until she was on the other side of the broken tomb. Coincidentally, it was the side that listed the names of those entombed there. In the square of the one that had been broken into, she read the name. Charles Woodhouse. She blinked. It was his tomb? Then she looked at the dates and knew it had to be Charles's father. Perhaps the Charles that Willard knew was actually a junior. Still, it was odd that his father's tomb had been broken into, and that he was found dead next to it. Or had the tomb been broken into after Charles's body was taken? She heard the sound of footsteps again, this time only a few tombs away. She shuffled past where she'd been and moved to another set of tombs. Carefully peering around one, she saw the edge of a crowbar sticking out. Immediately, she plastered herself against the tomb, heart pounding. Was her mind playing tricks on her? She looked again, and as sure she could be from the distance of at least 12 feet, there was a man's hand holding a crowbar. Mostly hidden, but visible enough to see what it was from her vantage point. Eva pulled out her phone and dashed another few tombs away, ducking down as she ran. Jerome answered on the first ring. Eva. I think someone's following me in the cemetery. He has a crowbar. Her voice came out in a hoarse whisper, but she couldn't help it. She was terrified. What if the man saw her? Should she keep running? Hold on. She could hear Jerome's muffled command to send units to the cemetery. Are you safe? Where exactly are you? I've got men on the way and I'm coming. She felt her dry throat close up from fear and dehydration. I'm trying to get away. I was by the tomb where I found Charles. His momentary silence made her think he was trying to find a way not to ask her why she was there, at least not yet, but he failed. What are you doing there? No, scratch that. Keep moving. Is the guy near you? Eva looked around trying to spot any movement, but it looked as if the crowbar was staying put, along with the person holding it. Eva, Jerome said, more insistent this time. She could tell he was walking, perhaps running, and she assumed it was to his car. That's when she heard sirens, but not on his end. On hers. No, I'm moving away. Good. Do you hear sirens? Yes, she whispered just as the crowbar retreated from view. At that moment, something bold and reckless overtook her, and she stood up just as she saw a tall man wearing a hooded jacket dart through the tombs. I see him. Stay put, Jerome practically bellowed through the phone. We'll be there soon. But he's getting away. Do not go after him, Jerome said, his tone brokering no space for argument. Eva frowned, but she did as she was told, staying where she'd stopped. The man raced to the opposite exit from where the sirens had grown loud, and was out of the gate before she could blink twice. If only she'd gotten a good look at him. But she was sure of one thing. It had been a man. His build gave him away. He went out the south gate. Will you send someone that way? Jerome didn't answer, but she heard him asking over his radio for what she'd suggested. Okay, almost there. She heard another siren blare nearby and then cut short. I'll be right there. He hung up without so much as a goodbye, but at that point she could see him jump out of his unmarked car and race down the path toward her. It was only then that Eva realized she was shaking. Are you all right, Eva? Jerome had both hands on her arms, and she focused on the details of the man in front of her to avoid breaking down. He wore dark blue slacks and a white button-up shirt that was open at the collar, with the sleeves rolled up his forearms. It wasn't even mid-morning, and he looked as if he'd stayed the night at the office. Perhaps he had. But it was his eyes that drew her. They were vibrant green, like the deep waters of the ocean, and they focused on her with a singular purpose: to make sure she was all right. Slowly, as she breathed in and out, aided by Jerome's coaching her to do so, she began to calm down enough to nod. I'm all right. He guided her over to a stone bench and nudged her to sit. She did, and felt the cool stone, a solid comfort underneath her. That was crazy. Jerome merely nodded, but she could see he desperately wanted to ask her what had happened. She saved him the question and jumped into her story about how she'd wondered whose grave Charles had been visiting, and why so early in the morning. Then she explained how the tomb had been broken into, and Jerome nodded as if he knew what she meant. This intrigued her, but she stored it away to ask after she explained what had happened. When I finally realized the sounds I'd been hearing weren't another morning walker, I just decided to hide to see what I could see. Brave woman, Jerome observed. Or scared. Either way, it allowed me to see a man's hand holding what looked like a crowbar. I was several feet away, but I'm fairly certain that's what I saw. And you think he was after you? Jerome asked. It was only then that she registered the notebook in his hand. How was she a witness yet again? I'm not sure. I was the only one around that I could see. Then when I called you and the sirens got closer, the man sprinted through the cemetery to the south gate. It was odd behavior to be sure, but I don't know that I was a target. Jerome didn't comment, but instead stood, directing her to follow him. Let's take a walk if you're up for it, he said. It was an odd suggestion, but there was something in his look that made her agree. And after he'd given directions to the officers there to look into the scene, he gently placed a hand on the small of her back and directed her to a path that she knew made a circle through the cemetery. Perhaps now she'd be able to get some answers from the handsome detective. Answers she wouldn't have gotten otherwise. I think you're meddling, he began. Me? Eva looked up at him with innocent, blinking eyes, but she could tell he wasn't buying it. Yes. If by meddling you mean looking into Charles Woodhouse's death, yes, that's exactly what I mean. His hand dropped from her back, but he remained close, walking next to her. And I'm sure you know that I'm not too happy about that fact. First of all, she said, pausing in their walk to meet his gaze, I'm not meddling. I've just asked a few questions. Of all the people who might have a reason to kill Charles. He gave her a pointed look. And I've learned some interesting things, that's all. And now you're here, being followed in a cemetery and calling me for help. She narrowed her eyes. Would you rather that I hadn't called? What? No, that's not what I meant. Then what? She spun away from him to keep walking, and he fell into step with her. Look, we've had this discussion before. I'm the detective. I do the detecting. You're the bed and breakfast owner. You do the bed and breakfasting. She made a face. I'm not trying to interfere. It's just that Willard was friends with Charles, and we happened to be curious about his life. And death, Jerome said dryly. That too. I see. Did you know that his father's tomb had been broken into? Was that the reason he was killed? It was a bold question, but one she had to ask. For starters, the tomb had been broken into a week before his death. This new information was shocking. So was he here to see the damage and someone killed him? Here before 9 in the morning to look at a tomb? When the staff isn't even in until 10? No, we don't think so. Then you've talked with the car that dropped him off. We didn't find someone who had. Eva was almost giddy that Jerome was sharing information with her, but she knew she had to play her cards right and not push him too much. You think the killer drove him then? It would be speculation, he said, but it's a possibility. So not Maeve or Xavier, she mused out loud. What about Stephanie? Now Jerome stopped, this time turning her to face him. What do you know about Stephanie? His voice was hard, but not angry. Eva shrugged. Not much. I talked with her at the club after my lunch with Xavier. Jerome looked at her for a long moment. And you know she's a diabetic. Yes, so? Eva said, trying to look innocent. I won't get Vicky in trouble, he said, his features softening slightly. I'm sure she told you that it's part of her revised cause of death. Yes, but to be clear, no one would have shared that with the news. His expression shifted slightly, so she told the whole club. I would vouch for them all with my life. Strong words, he said, his eyes narrowing. But I believe you. I'm not sure where the mole is, but we're going to find them. Eva nodded, but her attention fixated on what he'd said before. I honestly can't see how Stephanie could be involved. He waited, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to move on from the previous conversation, but finally he spoke. She doesn't have an alibi. Now it was Ava's turn to be surprised. She said she did. It was a family. The Laws? Yes, Jerome said, sighing and motioning for her to continue walking with him. She was babysitting for the Laws, and they didn't come home until the next day. The children were in bed by 9, and she woke them up at 7 to take them to school. That's a whole lot of time unaccounted for. And due to the time of death, we think it happened sometime early morning on Friday. When she was mostly alone, Eva commented. Yes. I'm assuming the Laws are wealthy. Do they have cameras or something? They were conveniently not working that night. Jerome's gaze was hard at this statement, but Eva knew it was likely more frustration. Either Stephanie had covered her tracks, or she had a serious case of bad luck. But what's her motive? Eva couldn't envision the kind young woman murdering her former lover. Well, there was a reason that Stephanie stopped seeing Charles. Turns out that Maeve found out about the affair, wanted a divorce, and then Xavier was introduced to Stephanie. Ava's eyes widened. Don't tell me. Stephanie and Xavier? Yes, but she claims it was just a fling, that she and Charles were getting back together. But you think that maybe she wanted to make sure Charles was out of the picture. They walked on in silence for a few minutes, most of Ava's anxious feelings having abated. She was thankful that Jerome hadn't insisted on questioning her in a more invasive manner, at least not initially. Even now, her heart still raced a bit, but at least her head was clear and her legs felt steady. Better? He asked when they circled back to where she'd initially found Charles. Yes, she said, surprised that it was the truth. Good, because I've got an errand I need to run. Oh? She met his gaze. I'm going to serve a warrant on Stephanie Arthur, he admitted. But... Her question died on her lips. What could she say? It was a warrant. A judge had obviously seen probable cause for him to issue the warrant. She could only hope that Stephanie, while she may look guilty, hadn't had anything to do with Charles's murder. If that was the case, she knew that Jerome would uncover that truth. He was too good not to. Chapter 12. Jerome had insisted he'd take Eva wherever she needed, but going home didn't seem like a smart choice, at least not immediately. While she didn't voice her fears to Jerome out of worry over looking like an alarmist, she didn't want to lead someone back to her home. She'd instead asked him to take her back to the police station where she could see Vicky. She was the only person that Eva felt she could talk to at the moment. Still, as they drove to the station, she thought of how foolish she was being. If anyone wanted to know who she was or where she lived, it was as easy as knowing her name and searching for her. That was a fact she hadn't liked when she went into business over 6 years before, but things had been a little different then. Not that it was that long ago, but she'd been less worried about internet stalkers. Then again, if she weren't meddling in a murder investigation, would she have even found herself in a quandary like this? Ava? Jerome said. She blinked and realized he'd been talking, but she hadn't been listening. I'm sorry. What did you say? Are you all right? He pulled into the station parking lot and up to the front door. I'll be fine. Just thinking. His eyes narrowed like he was going to argue with her, but instead he just inclined his head momentarily. Have a good day. You too? She said, though it was more of a question. She had to assume a warrant was a good thing, but how could she really know? It'll be a day, he muttered. And with that she got out and left him to drive away. As she watched him drive off, his last statement made her think. She had Vicky to talk with when she had a difficult day, but who did Jerome have? It was an odd thought, one that didn't feel very professional to her, but one she'd had nonetheless. He was new to the area, and she didn't know if he was seeing someone. Did that mean he went home after work and ate dinner alone and lived most of his life alone? For some reason, the thought made her sad. Shaking her head slightly, she cleared the odd thoughts from the forefront of her mind and made her way past security to see Vicky in the morgue office. Eva had never been a fan of elevators, so she headed for the stairs, which would also give her a bit of extra exercise. The temperature dropped significantly as she descended to the lower floor, and she shivered. When she stepped into the concrete hallway, she noticed the light blue walls had a few odd photographs scattered every few feet. Moments later, she was outside Vicky's office. The front was a partial glass wall, and today Vicky had the blinds open. Eva knocked once on the door, and Vicky, looking surprised, immediately motioned her inside. "What are you doing here?" she said, coming around her desk and giving Eva a hug. Somehow, though Eva hadn't said anything, Vicky knew she needed the physical contact. "You're shaking like a leaf," Vicky said. "What's wrong?" Vicky ushered her to a small couch, and once they'd sat down, Eva shared what had happened in the cemetery. For the second time. "This is unbelievable. You think the guy was following you, or was he there already?" Eva leaned back, clenching her hands in her lap. "I don't know. I assumed he was following me, but come to think of it, why would he have a crowbar? Weapon of opportunity?" Vicky mused. "Perhaps. But what if it was for a tomb?" "You mean like the tomb you saw already knocked in?" "Yes." Eva frowned. "It doesn't make sense why he would be back now, though. The deed was done, well, assuming that they were initially after Charles Wodehouse Sr.'s tomb." The women sat in silence, thinking about the facts for a few minutes before Eva sat up straighter. "Vicky, what's in a tomb?" Vicky arched her eyebrows. "Is this a trick question?" "No. A dead body." "What else?" "I'm assuming you mean aside from the burial materials." "After a long time," Eva hinted. "Bones?" "Yes." Eva saw Vicky's confusion. "And what's in bones?" "DNA." It was like a light had gone off in Vicky's mind. Exactly. "But what would anyone want with Wodehouse DNA?" Vicky asked. "Assuming that my hunch is correct, there could be a big reason for that, but we have to make some other discoveries first. Though it might take you, and possibly Elijah, on a trip to the tennis courts." Eva explained her idea, and then jumped to her feet, Vicky following suit. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To see a woman about an affair." Vicky's eyes narrowed, but she offered a look that said, "If you say so." Eva rushed out of the police department and hailed a taxi to take her to the Wodehouse residence. She had a hunch, but she needed to go to the source before it could truly be verified. Eva rang the doorbell another time, but still didn't get an answer. She'd been there nearly 10 minutes, and no one had come to the ornate, oversized door with a sleek modern handle. The house itself was also modern in design, the yard well manicured, and an expensive-looking car was in the driveway. Someone was home, but no one was answering. Frustration welled up in Eva. Was Maeve really not going to answer the door? It seemed a little petty. Or was it possible she was spending quality time with her butler? Eva stopped that thought where it started, not wanting to be or sound petty. Instead, she lifted a fist and knocked forcefully on the front door. As she did, it cracked open beneath her hand. Hesitating only a moment, Eva pushed on the door again, and this time it swung inwardly without a sound. "Hello?" she called out, leaning in. Nothing. "Hello? Maeve? Are you home? It's Eva Stewart. Hello?" There was still no response, and Eva looked back over her shoulder at the car in the driveway. There was no way to tell if Maeve had hired a car to go somewhere, or if she was actually home and indisposed. Still, when someone left, they made sure their doors were closed. She took one step inside and saw an alarm panel to the right of the door. It read, "Unarmed," in bold letters. Eva couldn't be sure, but that likely meant that someone was home, didn't it? Or at the very least that someone had forgotten to turn on the alarm when they left, and left the front door unlocked. No. The alarm bells were going off in Eva's mind, and she took a few more steps. "Hello? Maeve?" she said even louder. Still no reply, but she thought she heard the sound of a television on, or perhaps music playing. Closing the door so that the latch clicked this time, she made her way toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from upstairs, so she took them two at a time, reaching the landing slightly out of breath. "Hello?" Still no reply, but she could definitely hear the noise better here. It sounded like an infomercial. Making her way down the plush carpet of the hallway, she passed a few closed doors until she came to one that was open. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see the end of a bed that had been neatly made. The sound was definitely a television, and while it wasn't exactly loud, it wasn't quiet either. Was that why Maeve hadn't heard her? Eva was fraught with indecision as she stood at the partially open door. Go inside or slip back out like she hadn't been there? It was awkward enough to be in a stranger's house, let alone barging in unannounced. But something in her gut warned her that this wasn't normal. There was no reason for Maeve's front door to be open as it was, and for the alarm to be off with the car in the driveway. So, with more boldness than she felt, Eva pushed the door open and stepped into the bedroom. It was clearly a master bedroom. There was a large king-sized bed on one wall, with a couch at the foot that faced a television, which hung over the fireplace. There was a window seat on the opposite wall, and a door that likely led to the master bath. Eva immediately saw the back of Maeve's head resting against the couch while the TV played. "Maeve," she said more loudly this time. No response. Dread wrapped itself around her midsection. She did not want to find another dead body, but would she discover that if she walked around the couch? The thought that it was possible Maeve was in trouble and needed help pushed her forward to the couch where she saw, thankfully, that the woman was still breathing. Nonetheless, she looked pale and sweat glistened on her forehead. "Maeve!" Eva said, rushing to her side and reaching for a pulse. It was there, but weak. Quickly, Eva pulled out her phone and dialed 911. At least she hadn't been too late to do something for this Wodehouse, even if she still wasn't sure what the outcome might be. Before long, Eva heard the ambulance, and she rushed down to let them in. When she led them back to the room, she watched as they went to work assessing the situation and getting Maeve the help she needed. It was only then that Eva was able to see what she'd missed while she'd been so focused on the poor woman and her dire condition. There was a syringe on the coffee table, one that looked like what Eva thought insulin might come in, and there was a note lying open. Moving out of the way of the paramedics as they moved to take Maeve down the stairs, she stepped closer to the table. She could almost make out the words when Jerome entered the room. "And we meet again." "Detective," she said, biting her lip. Could she lean down and read it quickly before he caught her? "You find a way to show up in the most unexpected places," he said, pulling on blue gloves and walking toward her. "And what is it that has your attention?" She pressed her lips together. "The note," she admitted, "and the syringe." He came close and leaned down over the items. Seeing him do it, Eva stepped up next to him and did the same. When he didn't push her away, she focused on the note. "I can't take the guilt anymore. I'm sorry. Maeve." They both leaned back at the same time, sharing a look. "Do people usually sign suicide notes?" "That's not the only odd thing about this whole setup," he said, avoiding her question. He began to circle the scene as a photographer came and started taking photos. "How did you know?" she asked, after he'd been silent for a few minutes. "Know what?" "To come. I mean, how did you know this would be related to Charles's case?" "I didn't, but I figured it couldn't be a coincidence that there was an emergency call to his home. My boss caught wind of it right after you called dispatch, and she sent me. I had her send a team." "Smart," she admitted. "Your turn," he said, turning toward her. "My turn what?" "Your turn to tell me why and how you're here." A flutter of nerves assaulted her for a brief moment, but she consoled herself knowing that she had nothing to be afraid of. She'd only entered the residence when it was clear something was off. She told him just that, filling in all of the unusual details she'd encountered. He nodded, taking notes, and then when he was finished, he looked over at her. "It's odd that it was insulin," he said, almost as if to himself. "Because you took Stephanie into custody today?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes. Otherwise, with the current connection of the insulin, we might have pinned this on her as well. It's clearly not a suicide." Eva nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. "So it's someone else," she mused. "Someone else indeed." Chapter 13. When Eva left the Wodehouse home, she paused outside to gather herself. Closing her eyes, she allowed the craziness of the last few hours to wash over her, like the sun that lit the insides of her eyes with golden warmth. She was worried that Maeve wouldn't make it, worried that there was still a killer on the loose, worried that time was running out. When she opened her eyes, she caught a flash of movement from across the lawn. Tall, leafy palms and ferns lined the edge of the small yard, but someone had definitely been there. Eva hesitated for a moment. What if it was the person with the crowbar from the cemetery? But as she looked around the yard, with the police cars lining the street, she had a hard time believing someone who had run at the first sound of sirens would have come so close to the police now. Rushing forward, she came through a break in the vegetation and saw a tall figure and a shorter one rushing away down the street. It was a couple, a man and a woman, and they looked oddly familiar. At the corner, the woman paused to turn back, and that's when Eva realized who she was. It was Danny, her guest. She caught sight of Eva watching her and yanked the man, Ted, Eva assumed, around the corner until they disappeared from sight. Eva. Jerome came out of the house and was staring at her half in the bushes. I thought I saw someone I know. His eyes narrowed. Is it relevant to this case? She knew he meant Charles Woodhouse's death, but she wasn't sure how to answer it. Was it? I don't know, but I wouldn't mind a quick look into a couple I've got staying at my bed and breakfast. He walked across the small lawn to stand in front of her. Are you asking me to use police resources to look into your guests? He had the hint of a smile on his lips. It's more like I might know who's behind the leaked information, and it may have something to do with guests I've got staying at the inn. I mean, why would they be here? And hiding? She could see she had his interest, so she pulled up information from her phone and filled him in on her strange guests and how they seemed to turn up at all the right or wrong times. Then after she had given him all that she knew, her car arrived and she bid him goodbye. The ride back to the bed and breakfast gave her ample time to think as traffic had picked up. She blamed it on the warmer weather and spring break for some schools hitting early. Everyone wanted to be out and about since it was looking more like summertime in Key West than March. It was odd that Maeve had been targeted. There was no logical reason behind it. Then again, she still didn't know who had killed Charles, so it was possible someone had a motive no one knew about. Was that person Xavier? It was said he'd had a fling with Stephanie, but was that the motivation? Was it possible that this wasn't about money at all, but pure anger for seeing his father stealing Stephanie back from him? Then again, Xavier didn't seem like the type to really hold a grudge when it came to women. He seemed to operate on the plenty of fish in the sea principle rather than act the jealous lover. And it did seem drastic that he would attack his own mother, especially if there was any leeway in the will for her to offer him part of his inheritance early. So who stood to gain from Charles's death? Xavier wouldn't lose his job, so that was a bonus, but that also meant he wouldn't have any more time with his father to convince him to change the will in his favor. As for Maeve, it didn't stand to reason that she had killed her husband. From most accounts, she was trying to have him cancel the divorce, and there had been no evidence uncovered to point to the fact that Charles had truly changed the will to cut her out. Even if he had, would she feel so scorned over that? Hurt enough to kill her husband? The cab pulled up to the bed and breakfast, and Eva was stunned and dismayed to see the reporters were back in force. Want me to pull forward? The driver asked. She knew he meant to drop her off past the melee, but at this point it had started to become expected that she'd have to deal with reporters and dodge the press. No, that's all right, thank you. She paid, tipping generously, and then climbed out. They assaulted her as one, like an amoeba made of camera lenses and speaker booms. Miss Stewart, what can you tell us about Maeve Woodhouse's emergency? Why were you at the Woodhouse estate? Do you think it was suicide? She blinked. How did these reporters have such accurate information? She was shocked enough to nearly let the questions blurt out, but she managed to clamp her mouth shut in favor of a comment of silence rather than saying something she'd regret. Head down, she pushed past the mob and onto her property. One bold reporter tried to follow, but she closed the gate with a decisive click of the latch. While they continued to hurl questions at her like bombs, she kept her head down in determination. This was insanity, and There in the front room of her bed and breakfast, Ted and Danny sat in chairs reading magazines as if they hadn't just been half a city away. Her eyes narrowed, and she saw that Danny's magazine was upside down. Eva stalked past them and made her way to Poirot's cage. "There's my pretty bird," she said, feeling a bit of her stress melt at the familiar sight of him. Being an Amazon parrot, Poirot's plumage consisted of vibrant greens and bright yellows. There was a hint of red on his wings, but only a touch.
"Pretty bird gets a treat,"
he said, flapping to the door which she had just opened. "Yes, my pretty bird deserves a treat." She offered him a nut, and he took it, making pleasant sounds of contentment. Then he began to hum the theme song from the Addams Family, which always made her smile. Benita had taught him that last Halloween when she went through an old movie kick, and he'd kept it up, which was surprising. It often took real dedication to get Poirot to learn something, but once he did, if he liked it, you'd know about it. "One more?" she asked. He bobbed his head up and down. "Shake a wing," she said, and he did, recognizing her command. "Good bird."
"Pretty bird,"
he said, as if to say, "I concur." Eva turned and made her way back to her desk. She didn't want to remain in the main building, but she'd gotten a text from Benita when she was at the Wodehouse estate saying that she needed to do some shopping for supplies. That often took a few hours, and while the bed and breakfast wasn't staffed constantly, Eva felt better about keeping someone in close proximity to the desk while the vultures, the reporters, were out front. She had just gotten through several emails when her phone rang, showing Jerome's contact on the screen. "Hello?" "Hey, Eva," he said, his deep voice sounding a little weary. "What is it?" she asked, expecting the worst. "I looked into those names." Her gaze automatically lifted to where the couple still sat. Danny's magazine had been replaced by a laptop, but Eva noticed that she sat in a different seat, this one allowing for her back to be against the wall. Was she hiding what she was doing? Ted, on the other hand, had his head buried in his phone, typing with his thumbs as if his life depended on it. It was odd. She'd never seen them in this main space before. They'd spent most of their time in their rooms, which made sense if they were truly newlyweds, or many times they were out of the bed and breakfast. "And," she said, refocusing on her conversation with Jerome and the potential answers she expected to get from him. "They don't exist." "I see. Well, in a way they do." He backpedaled. "What does that mean?" He wasn't making sense. "There is no Ted Jackson with the birth date you gave me, but there is a Ted Daniels." "Why do I know that name?" she said, racking her memories. "Does Key West Daily mean anything to you?" She gasped. The newspaper! They were reporters. "And the other name?" She kept an eye on them, not wanting to say anything that would alert them to her conversation's true topic. "Also a reporter at the Daily. Real name Danny Jensen." "How nice that the first name stayed the same." "Yes." Jerome sounded suspicious. "Wait, are they in the room right now?" "Yes, that is true." "Do you want me to come over there and—" "That won't be necessary," she said, a smile to her words for the first time. It wasn't that she was happy they'd lied to her, but she was relieved she now knew who they were. "I think I can handle this." "You sure? I don't know if they've broken any laws, but I might want to question them if they're the ones leaking information about the case." "Would you prefer I don't say anything?" She snuck another glance at the two, but they were engrossed in whatever it was they were doing. "No, I can find them whether they're there or home. Preferably the latter, and as soon as possible." He laughed now. "All right, then, go get 'em." She laughed as well, happy that he had confidence in her. She hung up and let her gaze drift to the couple again, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't afraid of them. They were just reporters doing their jobs, but she didn't like being lied to. Then again, she had to admit their play was smart. Infiltrate the business where the woman who found the dead man worked, pretend to be a couple, do their job, but undercover, in a sense. Then she frowned. If they had followed her to Maeve's, where else had they followed her? Worry for Geraldine crept in, but she figured they had already taken the information they'd heard to the papers. She shivered. They had to have snuck into the backyard of the house bordering Geraldine's house. And there was still the frustration she'd felt when she caught sight of them snooping through her things, and then when she'd seen them down the street from the Wodehouse estate. Her fingers clenched into a fist, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. Moments later, she stood and walked around the desk toward the couple. "Hello," she said, the word coming out a little falsely peppy. Hi." Danny said, closing her laptop immediately and placing a protective hand over the top of it, as if Eva might take it away from her. She was certainly the one less comfortable with this undercover arrangement. Ted looked up from his phone, an eyebrow raised. "Hello?" he said, as if he couldn't believe she'd dare to interrupt him. "Yes, so I was having a talk with Detective Makos. Do you know him?" Danny's eyes went wide, but Ted merely blinked. "Why would we know him?" "He told me the most interesting thing. You see, apparently, I have 2 guests staying in my inn who are here under false names." Now Danny went pale, and her eyes snapped to the front door as if the police might barge in any minute. Ted's face began to shift from disgruntled guest to found-out reporter. "Oh, yeah?" "Yes. They've been going through my things, lying to my face, and leaking information to the media. Perhaps because they are the media." Neither of them said a word. I like to consider myself a fair person, so I advised Detective Makos that he didn't need to come here and escort them off my property. I assured him that they would leave voluntarily. Is that going to be how this works out? Or do I need to call him back? She raised her phone for emphasis. "We'll go," Danny said, shoving her laptop into a floral bag near her feet. "Just let us clear out the room and—" "Danny, chill out." Ted held up a hand and leaned forward. "Are you really kicking us out?" Ava's eyebrows rose. "Didn't you think I would when I found out that you're reporters for Key West Daily and not a newlywed couple looking to get away for a while?" she said with air quotes. "Hey, we're just doing our job, which is why I'm not having you arrested, Mr. Daniels. What could you charge us with?" "Ted," Danny said, as if warning him not to press his luck. "Several things, but let's leave it at the fact that you're lucky the detective isn't going to charge you with obstructing justice." "And how would we have done that?" "By leaking pertinent information that might have let a killer escape." For the first time, Ted's exterior facade cracked just a little. "We were just doing our job, and as you've said. But now it's time for you to do your job out there," she pointed, "with the rest of them." He shrugged and stood. "Fine." Then he walked toward the stairs to head to their room to clean it out. Danny paused in front of Eva, her voice going low. "I'm sorry, Miss Stewart. I didn't want this assignment, but Ted insisted he needed a wife." She rolled her eyes at the word. "I really like my job. I want to advance, and I understand, Danny." And she did. "Just make sure that the choices you make in order to keep your job don't hinder you as a person." Danny frowned, and then Ted called her from the stairs. "Hurry up, Danny." She sighed and offered Eva a small smile before she disappeared upstairs. Finally, Eva would feel comfortable in her home again, knowing that the information leak was gone and that the only customers she had were genuine customers with a desire to be at a bed and breakfast, not to glean information from its proprietor. Chapter 14. "Eva!" Vicky's voice was excited on the other end of the line. They hadn't talked in a few days, and while Maeve Wodehouse was stable in the hospital, everything else seemed to be at a standstill with regards to the investigation. The club had another meeting the next night, but Eva wasn't sure she was up to hosting. Her mind was racing with details of this real-life murder. The mystery man even haunted the background of her dreams. The last thing she wanted to do was to guide the eager group in a discussion of a fictional crime or the real one. "Eva?" Vicky spoke again, and Eva realized she'd answered her phone without saying anything. "Hi, it's me." She sat on the back porch, a light breeze tossing the white curtains back and forth and bringing with it the scent of the ocean. "Are you all right?" I am," she nodded, as if to assure herself she was. "I think I feel a little stuck by this case." "Well, let me unstick you." Vicky sounded excited, and the energy began to rub off on Eva. "What did you find? Remember that test you asked me to take care of?" "You mean you got the DNA from Xavier?" Vicky laughed. "I did just like you suggested. Elijah and I went to the club, and we decided to play tennis. He, of course, made sure that Xavier would be playing first, and then we played tennis." Silence followed her words, and Eva wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. "Oh, sorry." Vicky chimed in again, her voice bright. "Lab tech needed something." It sparked something in Ava's memory. "How was that date you went on?" That was out of the blue," Vicky said with a laugh. "I'll tell you about it later." So we were playing, and I made sure to put my stuff down next to Xavier's. You're right, flirting was definitely the way to go. I was able to borrow one of his wristbands, and it was loaded with sweat. She made a disgusted noise before continuing. I ran the DNA against the Charles Wodehouse we have here in cold storage, and you're right. The pieces Eva had so desperately been looking for were now coming into view. Charles wasn't his father, Eva said. No, he was not. Not even close. Too bad you didn't have any DNA from Maeve. Eva sat up. You did? But how? Evidence. The needle that was supposed to deliver the fatal dose of insulin had traces of her DNA on the tip. And she's definitely his mother, but the father is unknown. Good work, Vicky, Eva said. There's something to consider, though. What? Eva tugged at a strand of her hair. We get a lot of things passed down from our fathers. Certain physical traits like height, dental health, dimples, even handedness or mental disorders. It's not a sure thing exactly, but that could help when we think about identifying the father, and I noticed that Xavier is left-handed. I see. It was Vicky's turn to be quiet for a moment. You see what? What does that mean? Eva took a breath. It means I think I know who the father is, but I'm not sure how to draw him out. You shouldn't be drawing anyone out. I've got to report this to Detective Makos. Yes, of course, Eva said, now distracted. She had an idea forming, but it would require a bit of finessing. Well, I'll let you go. Thanks for the good news. I think you have just cracked this case wide open. Eva, Vicky started to say, but Eva hung up. She felt bad, but when an idea took hold, it seized. She searched through her recent calls and recognized Xavier's number. She hadn't saved it in her phone because she hadn't expected to be calling it again, but desperate times... Eva. Xavier sounded pleased, and it was obvious he had saved her number from when they'd gone to lunch. Yes, hello. She took a deep breath and tried to sound as genuine as possible. I was wondering if I could ask for a favor. Sure, anything. The way he said anything made her think that came with strings attached, perhaps those that led her into another uncomfortable meal situation. But still she had to try. I have found myself in a bit of a situation, she said, deciding to draw from real life to make it as authentic as possible. I've had guests staying at the inn who don't seem to be who they say they are. That doesn't sound good. No, I found one of them going through my desk the other morning, and it bothers me. You mentioned you know a good PI, and I was wondering if you could share their name so I could reach out. I'd like to hire the best. She let out a quiet breath once the question was out. Oh, well, I haven't talked to my guy in a while, but I could put you in contact with him. All right, that would be great. Should I just give him this number? Yes, but... Here she took in another steadying breath. She had to play this just right. Can you not mention my name? I just want to meet him in person, you know? I'd rather it not get out that I'm letting people stay at my bed and breakfast without proper identification. That's kind of odd, he said. But I guess I could do that. Should I just tell him to meet you somewhere? Where do you usually meet? She blurted the question and pressed her lips together. She should have had a place in mind, a neutral area where she could have police there, and usually the club. I mean, I could have him meet me there and you could show up. I'll introduce you. That'd work. Then maybe we could get dinner. Eva made a face. This was exactly what she wanted to avoid, but she didn't see an alternative. I suppose that should work. Tomorrow, then? She'd avoided his question on purpose, but he must have assumed she was agreeing to it all. She'd cross that bridge when they came to it. Tomorrow. See you then. And now she needed to call Jerome. Chapter 15. Eva stood anxiously in the large library of the Glenna Club where Xavier had told her to wait. Her gaze kept going to the corner where a camera had been installed, but she looked away just as quickly. When her phone buzzed, she looked down to see that Vicky was calling, but there was no time to answer her call at the moment. Feeling like a terrible friend, she sent the call to voicemail and then turned her phone on silent. She needed all of her focus to be right here, right now. She was here to meet with Xavier's contact, but she'd also cleared it all with Jerome first. To say he had been unhappy about her decision to schedule a meeting before she talked with him was putting it mildly, but finally she'd been able to convince him that it was the best way for them to get the answers they needed, as well as arrest a murderer. Still, she had to be here for the face-to-face aspect of it, and she was quite nervous, even if she was trying to tell herself she wasn't. It felt as if Xavier had been gone for a long time, but when she checked the time on her watch, it had only been about 10 minutes. She paced to the other side of the room, browsing the spines and trying to shake off the feeling of nerves. She'd had a meeting with Jerome and his boss about how she would proceed during the meeting, so she knew what she needed to say, but knowing and doing were two different things. When the door finally opened, she turned to see Xavier walk in with the man who had met with Maeve the other day. "Hey, Eva," Xavier said. "James, this is Eva Stewart." James's eyes flashed with recognition, but then he looked to Xavier and back to her, no doubt assessing the situation. "Hello, Miss Stewart." "I believe we've seen each other," she said, deciding it was best not to beat around the bush, since he was clearly already sensing that something was not quite what he'd expected. "You know one another?" Xavier said. He looked between Eva and James. "Why did you need me to get in contact with him, then? I'm confused." Eva took a deep breath, reminding herself to remain calm. "I wanted to meet with this man, and you, for a very specific reason." James tensed. "What are you talking about?" "You see, it all started when I found Charles Woodhouse's body in the cemetery." She met Xavier's gaze and felt bad that he would have to learn a hard truth in this manner. "Wait, what?" Xavier asked. "It's what brought my attention to this club, actually. My friend Willard is a member, and he'd known your father. He said that something wasn't right about Charles's death, that it couldn't have been an accident." "Everyone knows that. It's been all over the papers," James said. "It has been." Her mind supplied a picture of Danny and Ted, and she was thankful yet again that they were out of her bed and breakfast. "But then I started speaking with the family. With your mother." She looked at Xavier. "And then with you." He frowned as realization dawned. "And here I thought you wanted to have lunch with me." He tried to make a joke out of it, but she could see his questions were rising. "No one had a true reason to kill Charles." "But Stephanie was arrested," James pointed out. "Yes, she was, but I'd spoken with her, and despite her alibi being difficult to prove, she wasn't the one who killed Charles." "How do you know?" James asked. "Because there was a stronger motive at work." "Which was?" he challenged. Xavier just looked between them. "Anger and money? Pure and simple? Perhaps you could even say retribution?" "Oh?" James ground out, his forehead wrinkling with anger. "Yes, because of a simple slip-up. Perhaps a misspoken word or a missive of guilt. Either way, the truth came to light, and Charles had to die." "What is going on? Who killed my father?" Eva looked to James. "Shall I tell him, or do you want to?" James was angry now. His face had turned red, and she saw his hands were fisted, but she also saw some of the agony that rested beneath the surface. When he didn't respond, she pressed ahead. "Xavier, this isn't going to be easy for you to hear, but—" "No," James cut her off. "He doesn't need to be part of this. Let him go, and we'll talk." She didn't like the look she saw in his eyes. She had a feeling if he'd had no trouble killing Charles and poisoning Maeve, he might easily consider killing another person. "What were you going to say?" Xavier asked. His gaze drilled into Eva's. "Tell me." "James is your father, not Charles." James clenched his jaw at her announcement, but Xavier's mouth fell open in obvious shock. "He's... what?" "I know it's hard to hear, but there's a reason Charles was killed at the cemetery." Xavier ran his hands through his hair. He spun in a circle and then walked to the small bar at the back of the room. "I need a drink." Eva noticed that Xavier had left the path from James to her wide open, so she stepped behind the couch and walked to where she was close to Xavier again. Consequently, she knew the camera angle was best from there as well. After drinking down a small glass of amber-colored liquid, he turned to James. "Is it true?" "Yes," James said through clenched teeth. "Why didn't you tell me?" Xavier poured another drink. "All this time. I've worked with you for years." But James didn't answer his son. He merely kept his murderous gaze on Eva. Tell me how you found out, Xavier said. He turned to give Eva his full attention. She was aware that James was watching her closely, but this was the moment of truth. His response to this was what the police needed to hear. It was time to prove her hunch was more than that. Well, I didn't know at first, she said, stepping again behind a couch. But I knew there had to be a reason your father was killed, once it was labeled a murder, of course. First, there was the fact that somebody had framed Stephanie. Sure, there were rumors that she wanted your father's money, but when I spoke with her, it seemed she merely wanted to move on with her life. Then, naturally, I considered you and your mother. Xavier looked shocked, which would have been almost amusing if not for the situation. I'd have no reason to kill my father. But you did. He looked between Eva and James. He was going to fire you. Fire you from a position that would have qualified you to finally access your trust after years of what I'm sure was difficult work for you. She could visibly see him swallow. As for your mother, the waters were murkier there. She seemed to genuinely want to stop the divorce proceedings with your father, but I couldn't figure out if that was due to a change in her feelings, or if she realized what her life would be like without your father's money. My mother has her own money, Xavier spat, clearly annoyed with Ava's cold evaluation. Then that settles it. No motive. He seemed taken aback. Which brings us to you and your, biological father. James had been quiet up until this point, and it was as if she could see the quietly simmering rage boiling in his chest. Yes, please tell us how you got to this point, Miss Stewart. His tone all but added, it will likely be the last thing you say. And while that was a terrifying point for him to make, she had information and backup he knew nothing about. It was at the cemetery where you made your biggest mistake. Well, I should say where you made both of your mistakes. His eyes narrowed. That early morning when you lured Charles to the cemetery to offer him the proof he needed to divorce Maeve was the same morning that you injected him with the insulin you stole from Stephanie's stash. But you miscalculated. Perhaps it was due to Charles's weight being more than you'd counted on, or your timing just didn't line up. Either way, you had to kill him, and quickly, so you pushed him into a tombstone, and that was that. What proof are you talking about? Xavier asked. You're actually the product of an affair James had with your mother years ago, Xavier. Eva softened her tone. You told me yourself that you've always used James as a private investigator. Your mother did as well. Whether their affair lasted months or days, I don't know, but it was enough for her to become pregnant with you. She paused for a moment before continuing. The only thing is, she didn't tell James whose baby it was. I assume it was natural for her to break off any extramarital endeavors once she became pregnant. It might have even forced monogamy for them both for a long time, but that didn't last. Silence filled the library, but Eva still needed to push ahead. She needed James to confess. The part I can't figure out is how James knew to look. Your father's tomb was broken into weeks ago, and the only thing stolen from tombs is jewelry. But I checked, and your grandfather wanted nothing buried with him, so the next logical thing came to me. Whoever broke into his tomb wanted bones, and the DNA associated with them. It would have been easy for James to prove his hunch about you once he had the bones. Your DNA and Charles Sr.'s DNA aren't a match. We've checked. And that's what makes me believe that James is actually your father. He killed Charles purely out of anger. After all, Charles took the place of your father when James could have had that role. He turned that anger on Maeve for not telling him, and she ended up in the hospital, also poisoned by insulin. Suddenly, you're a lonely orphan ready for a new friendship with your real father. Despite all of his bravado, Xavier had tears in his eyes as he turned to James. Is this true? Is any of this true? James's expression was a mixture of anger and grief, but he nodded. If I'd have known you were my son, I never would have let you be raised by that bully of a man. I always said I wanted to raise my kids right, not like my dad hounded me and my brother. I just wanted a chance. How did you know to check? Eva asked. She kept her tone even, and in the heat of the moment, James answered. Maeve was intoxicated one night at the Glen Club. She called me to take her home, even though we usually stayed apart after everything that happened so long ago. I was driving her home, and she said something about all that Charles didn't know, and how it would ruin him if he found out. Then she said she had regrets about us. How she'd ruined Xavier's life. It didn't take much to put it all together, but I needed proof. Why hurt my mom? Xavier said, his sadness replaced by anger now. Because she wouldn't take me back. I spoke with her that day you came to the restaurant, James said to Eva. But then I went to see her. I told her I'd gotten rid of Charles for us all, and she refused me. Said I didn't know what I was talking about, and... He shook his head. You poisoned her like you poisoned Charles. Yes! James's cheeks were red, and he clenched his fists. I did, because I'm done being the one that the rich use to take out their trash. I'm done covering up for people's mistakes. So you made your own, Eva said, sending a meaningful look at the camera. Yes, and I found I'm okay with that. I am sorry for what I'll need to do now, though. Suddenly, James pulled out a knife. Both Xavier and Eva stepped back. But Dad, Xavier said. One look at him, and Eva could tell he was ready to pull out every trick in the book to get James not to hurt them, even pretending to call him father. Sadly, James saw right through it as well. You know, that might have worked if I hadn't gotten to know you. Xavier swallowed and stepped back again, bumping into a freestanding globe. It's too late, kid. If I'd been your father to start, well, you might have had a chance. James stepped forward, knife extended, just as the library doors burst open and a team of police swept in, guns drawn. Cutting it a little close, Eva said as Jerome made a beeline to her. Are you all right? He asked, stepping close and ignoring her comment. Facing a killer will never be easy, but yes, I'm all right. Jerome looked as if he wanted to say more, but instead he nodded once and then turned back to the chaos. Ava's job was done, but it wasn't satisfying to see the extreme sadness on Xavier's face. He was still young and would be able to regroup and move past this, but his life would forever be changed. Finally, Jerome came back after making sure everything was taken care of. I'll take you back to the Keys. That would be nice. And there is one good thing to come of this day. What's that? Eva said as they walked out of the dark library and into the afternoon sunlight and ocean breeze. Maeve is past the worst of it. She's going to be fine. That is wonderful news, Eva said as she slid into the front seat of Jerome's unmarked car. And it was. If there was any happy ending to be made from the mess of the twisted lies Maeve, Charles, and Xavier had created for themselves, this was a good start. Chapter 16. I'm going to say it right now. Willard's eyes narrowed. His tone was serious, which was funny considering he had a sprinkling of powdered sugar on his upper lip from the key lime bars Eva had made. I'm disappointed to have not been there at the end of the case I all but handed to you, Eva. Eva laughed, sipping from the champagne Elijah had insisted on bringing to their book club meeting. I, for one, am happy to have not been there, Pete said. He shuddered at the mere thought, and everyone else laughed. If you'd been there, Geraldine emphasized her words with a pointed finger at Willard, you would have been more focused on the snacks than staying out of the reach of a killer. Be thankful. Hear, hear, Elijah said. Willard blushed, but then shrugged. I mean, did they have snacks?
Snacks! Pretty bird! Pretty bird gets a treat!
Everyone burst into laughter as Poirot, sitting in his outdoor cage, interjected himself into the conversation at just the right time. As always. I didn't have a choice, Eva said to Willard after offering Poirot an almond. We couldn't let James in on the fact that we knew who he was. It had to be as if Xavier had gotten him a real meeting with the client. I could have been a client, Willard said with a pout. You could have, Eva said, working to pacify him. But it didn't work out that way. It worked out just as it should, Vicky said. Eva knew Vicky sounded more confident than she felt. Before their meeting had started, she'd expressed to Eva that she had been worried. She didn't like the fact that Eva hadn't brought anyone with her, though Eva had to remind her that she'd brought the police with her. While it had quieted Vicky, it hadn't totally convinced her, or so Eva thought. Does this mean we can get back to fictional murder? Pete said. Groans rose up around the circle, but Eva said, How about a trip to Egypt? She grinned as she held up a copy of their next murder mystery book club book, Crocodile in the Sandbank by Elizabeth Peters, and everyone burst into smiles. This is one of my favorite series, Geraldine said, rubbing her hands together like she was a kid in a candy shop. I've never read any of these, Vicky said, snatching the copy from Eva to examine more closely. Chatter erupted around the group as those who had read the Amelia Peabody mysteries before began to give a slight but spoiler-free overview of the series and how the new readers would love them. Eva was enjoying the scene, but she looked up as a tingling sensation overtook her. There, peeking around the curtain that separated the group from the rest of the back deck, stood Jerome. "Excuse me, fellow readers," Eva said, standing. "I'll be right back. Can you all discuss the venue for our next monthly dinner?" They all agreed, and soon the air was filled with food options and cuisine favorites as Eva slipped behind the curtain. "Is everything all right?" "Hello to you, too," Jerome said, an amused smile on his face. "They are a lively bunch, aren't they?" "They are. And hello." "Hello. And nothing is wrong. I just wanted to drop by and tell you that James confessed to everything. He's going to jail for a long time." "It's sad," she said, taking in a deep breath. "I mean, he deserves jail, of course, but the fact that Maeve kept the truth from him all these years." "How did you know?" She blinked in surprise. "Know what?" "That James wanted to be a father. It was the way you said it, like you knew he was angry because of missing that. As you know, I have a bit of a PI background myself. I looked into him before our meeting. I assumed you'd done as much, but I wanted to know what his childhood was like. He came from a broken and abusive home. His brother is in prison in Colorado, and his mother died at a young age from a fall down the stairs. It was a leap, but I put two and two together. The abuse he wanted to be away from. It seems children of abuse tend to go in one direction or the other. They follow in the same footsteps, or they run as far away from them as possible. Since there was no history of abuse on James, and he'd made a seemingly successful career out of being a private investigator, I took the chance that he'd be the latter. Well, until he wasn't. Yes, there's that." They stood there in uncomfortable silence for a moment, but then Eva spoke up again. "You could join us. We're celebrating with champagne, and we're talking about the next book we're going to read." Jerome looked thoughtful for a moment, but then shook his head. "Tempting, but I've got too much on my plate at the moment. Maybe someday I can become a regular MMBC member." She grinned at the fact that he knew their acronym. "You're always welcome." "Thanks, Eva." He turned to go, but stopped. "And even though I don't want to encourage you, thanks for your help on this case. Don't do it again." Rather than answer, Eva merely smiled and disappeared behind the curtain to rejoin the group and their lively debate on seafood versus Cuban food. Eva and Vicky sat with their toes dangling in the cool water of the pool. The rest of the MMBC had left, but Vicky said an extended Eva visit was exactly what she needed, so they'd slipped out of their sandals to dip their toes in the cool water while drinking iced tea and lime. "I'm sorry," Eva began. "For what?" Vicky looked over at her. "For not sharing that I talked with Jerome, for worrying you." She blushed and looked away. "It's silly, really," Vicky admitted. "You were with the police, of all people, but I think it reminded me of something." "What?" Eva said, keeping her voice gentle so that Vicky would feel free to share in time. "I was dating a guy, this was years ago, in Texas. He was a hotshot detective and very handsome." Vicky winked, which made Eva smile. "But one night he didn't call me back. I had no idea where he was or what had happened. I finally had to call his boss. He worked for a different precinct than I did. Anyway, I found out that he'd been shot while on duty. He'd gone to take down some really bad drug lords, and there one moment, gone the next." Eva let the silence linger, sensing that Vicky wasn't done yet. "I know this is completely different, but when I didn't hear from you, it brought back all those nasty memories. All the fear, all the pain. You're the best friend I've made in Key West, and I'd hate to see you." Her voice broke. "Well, I'd hate to see you hurting anyway." Eva felt moisture in her eyes and reached over to wrap an arm around her friend. "I'm sorry. I had no idea." "Of course you wouldn't, darling," Vicky said, her accent coming back thickly through her tears. "I can't expect you to always be on call. It's just something I struggle with. Now that I know, I'll do my best to at least text if I can't call." "You do what's best, and I'll be all right," Vicky said, smiling to show she meant it. "Okay, but..." Just then Ava's phone went off, playing an upbeat melody into the stillness of the evening. She pulled it from her back pocket, but didn't recognize the number. Wonder who this is," Take it. What if it's a potential customer? Eva wanted to explain that they had a specific number for that, but the area code matched Key West, so she went ahead and answered. Hello? Dulzura! Ruben? His deep laugh reverberated out of the smaller speaker of her phone. I have been gone 2 weeks, and you do not recognize me. Sorry, I didn't recognize the number. Sí. His Latin accent was heavier than normal. Sorry, I am still in Cuba. He pronounced it cu, with a short ba sound at the end. But I come back mañana. Tomorrow? That's great. See? He laughed at something happening near him before returning to their conversation. I missed our café date. I'm sorry. Did you get my message about what had happened? See, I understand. I was just thinking of you. Mi madre wants to meet you. Says I make you sound like an ángel. Oh, Ruben, she said, unsure how to respond to that. Vicky's eyebrows rose, but she shook her head as if to say, don't ask. Well, have a safe trip back. I'm spending some time with Vicky right now. Ah, lo siento. I'll let you go. But we must make another day for café, see? Yes, of course. Adios. Goodbye, Ruben. She hung up, and the air around them went back to the normal quietness, intermixed with a few evening birds chirping. What was that all about? Eva reminded Vicky that she'd missed coffee with Ruben at the start of all of this, and that he'd been out of town since then. You need to make a decision about that man, because there's no doubt he has a thing for you. Eva considered her friend's question and sighed. It's just, I've known him ever since I came to Key West. He's done all of the renovations on the bed and breakfast, as well as built my cottage. He's a good friend. So what aren't you saying? Eva sighed, thinking how odd life could be at times. The murder of Charles Wodehouse had been solved, and now here she was, embroiled in another mystery. Who was Ruben to her? I honestly don't know, Vicky. Her perfectly groomed eyebrows rose. You don't? Or you don't want to? I think, for now, he's my friend and an occasional business contact. Any more than that would be more than I'm willing to consider at this point. Because of someone else? Vicky said, her eyes sparkling in the bistro lights that reflected back against the water. An image of Detective Jerome Makos rushing to her side after the police barged into the library at the Glenna Club came back to her. There had been genuine concern in those bright green eyes, and it had all been focused on her. But he'd made it clear he wasn't interested in coming to her book club, and he barely tolerated her presence when it came to case things, though that was understandable. And of course there was the fact that he'd so harshly judged her before even knowing her when they'd first met, and no, not because of someone else. Because I'd rather focus on running my bed and breakfast, Eva said, though it sounded more like she was convincing herself. And I'd like to solve more real-life cases without the hindrance of a romantic attachment, either to a good-looking contractor or a handsome detective. She thought silently. Let's watch a movie, Vicky said, pushing to her feet. Something funny, with a touch of romance. As long as it's not set in a cemetery, I'm game. Eva laughed and stood as well, handing over a clean towel to her friend as she dried her own feet. A movie sounded nice, but what sounded even better was time spent with a new best friend where dead bodies weren't going to be an issue. This recording of The Graveyard Thief was presented by Dreamscape Media, LLC. Narrated